Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will be discussing making sense of earnings data for medico-legal reports. We're going to start our session now. We'll be finishing off at 1 o'clock and we really hope you enjoy it. Just before we start, there's just a couple of things we need to check. Right. So just to make sure that we all know how to use this platform, there's a couple of things that we normally just check with our attendees. When we are going to engage with each other, especially when we're discussing sensitive topics, please be mindful to remain respectful in your engagement and also try to be patient. Sometimes the internet does play its ways with us. So when you hear a little scratching in the background, we are usually attending to that. You've been sent a unique link to this particular webinar, so please don't share it with anyone else, otherwise you won't be able to access the webinar. It's unethical to record this webinar without permission. The intellectual property belongs to the speakers and the host of this webinar, and thus it would be unethical to record it. But as an attendee, you'll note that your video and your sound has been muted. This is done to minimize the distractions to both the presenter as well as the audience listening in. Just some technical introductions to those of you that are joining us on the Zoom platform instead of YouTube. You'll see below that if you're struggling to hear anything, you can check your audio settings at test speaker and microphone. That's usually found below here, there where the unmute button was. Okay. And then we utilize the chat box function should you have any questions, or if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, our team will attend to that. Okay, then if you would like to ask the presenters a question at the Q&A section of this program, we want to ask you to utilize the raise hand function, which you should see turns green once you've raised your hand, and also gives you the option to lower your hand should you choose to stop asking that question, or should the question have already been asked by someone else. We also have a Q&A function that's next to the raise hand button. In that Q&A function, you can ask questions directly to the panel or directly to a specific person in this particular panel that we'll be presenting today. Usually when you get a presentation on Zoom, this is the type of slideshow screen that will be displayed, and you'll see at the top, there will be a little screen that reads that I am busy sharing my screen as the presenter. So that's just something for the presenters to note. The program for today will be as follows. I hope you can all see. Essentially, we're just going to do a quick check-in. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Sharon Mnyaka, who is the Interest Group Chair for Psycholegal Activities and Psycholegal Work in SAOPSA. She'll be introducing all of the speakers of the day to you. And then right at the end, you'll see there by 12:40, we'll have a Q&A section, or Q&A section. All right, we hope you enjoy it, and I will be handing over to Sharon now.
A very good morning to everyone joining us via the Zoom link and via the SAOPSA YouTube page. Thank you very much, Louise, for the netiquette. So colleagues, we are very excited to be hosting you this morning. So I am currently the chair of the SAOPSA Psycholegal Interest Group, and I am also working as an organizational psychologist in the medical legal field. So what is really such a privilege for me is on day one of opening up this event, we had more than 200 people registering. So that is very exciting, and we are committing to ensuring that we will be able to continue to engage you as our medical legal community. So today is really about making sense of the earnings data. We want people to engage the different earnings data providers. We want to be able to unpack a little bit around where this data is sourced from. So thank you very much for all the questions that you sent through. These questions will be addressed by our panel as we go through the conversation. The questions that you might have in addition to what you have sent through, please make use of the Q&A, and right at the end, these questions will be addressed. So I would like to introduce our very impressive panel. And they have all long CVs with lots of exciting work that they've done over the years, but I will not be getting into too much detail. So first up on our list of panelists is Manoko Ratala, who is an industrial psychologist and past president of the SIOPSA, so Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology of South Africa. SIOPSA, Manoko brings forth wealth of knowledge around medical legal work. So I'm very excited to hear what she's going to share with us around her perspective of the medical legal work that she's been doing. Also on our panel is Charles Duplessis, who's a senior actuary from Monroe Forensic Actuaries. And he is going to bring a whole lot of perspective for us in terms of the reports that we're writing as industrial psychologists. So Charles would have been one of the people that receives our reports if you are an industrial psychologist writing for the Road Accident Fund, or you're writing for plaintiff attorneys, and you would provide information that would help him calculate the loss of earnings. So he will give us some perspectives around that, information that they would require from their side as actuaries, and also just some guidelines for us to help us understand the type of information we need to be looking for. Also on our panel is Robert Koch from Koch Consulting Actuaries. Rob currently is on his way to court, so he will join us as soon as he's able to. And you would recognize Rob Koch from the Quantum Yearbook, which has been in publication since 1990. So he is also going to bring in that perspective around understanding the data that you find in the Quantum Yearbook, how to apply it, how it's sourced, and any questions that people might be having in terms of understanding which data sources they need to use. Also on our panel, we have Jan Beelders, who's the MD of Analytical HR. Jan is an earnings expert, and you would have seen his numerous publications, which have helped us to understand a bit around earnings data in South Africa. So Jan is going to unpack a little bit around the stats essay data, address some of the questions that you have, and also just to guide us on the questions that industrial psychologists might need to consider as they're working with the different earnings data available in South Africa. We also have on the panel Morag Phillips, who's an executive director at 21st Century. Morag has been working for 21st Century for the past 20 years, and she brings extensive experience in rewards and remuneration data. And she's going to share with us in terms of their perspective of how they've been calculating their data, when to use it, anything that we need to consider as experts working with earnings data in the medical legal field. Also on our panel is Martin Westcott, who is from Willis Towers Watson. So Willis Towers Watson is a global organization, and it has recently incorporated PE Corporate Services as from the 1st of March 2020. So many of you would recognize PE Corporate Services and not make the link with Willis Towers Watson. So PE Corporate Services now forms the SA Talent and Rewards Division of Willis Towers Watson, and they bring a wealth of experience in terms of the rewards and remuneration data. So Martin will share a bit more around their earnings data that they provide, how to use it, any questions that people have brought forward around, how is this data relevant in terms of the medical legal field? So hopefully you'll get a little bit of clarity around that. Also sitting on our panel is Averil Ryder. Averil is a master reward or remuneration specialist, and she is the owner of Averil Ryder Global Reward Specialist. So the value of having Averil on the panel is that she looks broadly at the different earnings data providers, works with different surveys. So she would be able to guide us in terms of the trends, address some of the questions that people might have around making sense of earnings in the world of work. So you'll see that we have a diverse panel, and each panelist will have 20 minutes to give us some insight from their lens around the earnings data that they make use of. So some of your questions related to which earnings data provider is better. So in my view, it's not about who is better than the other, but really about understanding the context in which we're using this earnings data. Who is the client that I'm working with? When is this data relevant to be used? How do I access it? Is there accreditation required? How do I start to ask the critical questions as I build up a case to determine the loss of income for the claimant? So I will not continue anymore, but will hand over to our panel to share with us the different insights as we all make sense of earnings data in the medical legal field. Thank you very much. And our first panelist is Manoko Ratala. Over to you, Manoko.
Good morning, everyone. I think thank you very much, and a special word of welcome to all the panelists, as well as all the industrial psychologists and aspiring industrial psychologists that are practically joining us on this webinar today. Am I audible? I just want to check quickly.
Yes, you are, Manoko.
Yes,
thank you so much. Thank you. Sure, I'm actually quite, my heart is filled with joy today, and I'm thinking of about 4 or 5 years back when we muted the possibility of a psycho-legal or medico-legal interest group at SIOPSA, and to see that we are at this point, I think for me just says, you know, visions are valid. You can have a vision about something and actually get to achieve it. So I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity, and more than anything impressed, I think, as a past president of SIOPSA, to see that we have been moving forward as a collective, and we are growing, and we are making spaces available even in times of the pandemic to learn together and to grow together. So thank you so much to the current president and the chairperson of the medico-legal group as it stands. I thought with my years of experience in medical legal work, I just want to be philosophical about it. And I've looked at all of the questions that you have, and you know, they're quite basic, they're very technical, but I thought sometimes we need to go to basics and talk about the untold earning stories and the psyche of these claims, and how we find ourselves in this quagmire. And how I'm going to do that is to just take you through a journey. I've got 20 minutes. And you might wonder what's happening here. Why am I talking about the ecosystem? But I want to refer to the concept and the analogy of an ecosystem as it relates to claims. The road accident fund claims are not the only claims we do. We've done claims for divorce settlements, we've done claims for medical negligence, and a whole lot of other third-party claims that come through. So for me, it's important to understand the psyche around this, so that we know what it is on a bigger scale and at a higher level, what we are addressing here. And then I will talk briefly also about what the industrial and organizational psychologist is expected to do, again, at a very high level. Hopefully, as we move forward in terms of this space, we can have practical courses that are more in-depth, that bring out the more technical aspects of the knowledge that we need to have. So I just want to quickly talk about the ecosystem, as I indicated. And I think for me, this is quite important. It's a basic geography lesson, if one would have it. But in an ecosystem, we have all living things. We've got plants, animals, organisms in any given area that interact with each other. There are living environments as well as non-living environments, such as the weather, the earth, the sun, the soil, the climate, and all of that surround living things. So it's an interaction between things that are animate and things that are inanimate. And what are the functions of this ecosystem? Generally, in biology, we know that it's the exchange of energy and nutrients in the food chain, the sustenance of plant and animal life on the planet, and decomposition of organic matter. And yes, you are in the right session or in the right webinar. We are talking about earnings data. And there's a link in terms of all of this information that I'm bringing forth now. All right, and then if there is an ecological imbalance, it's when a natural or a human caused disturbance disrupts the natural balance of an ecosystem. And we are currently experiencing one, I think, as the world, as humanity, in the name of the novel coronavirus. There's been an ecological imbalance, and we have seen, the consequences of it. And some of the other consequences that happens are pollution of the air, degradation of natural resources, the soil erosion, deforestation, depletion of wildlife and marine ecosystems, shortage of energy, mineral resources. And what we are seeing is the climate change that is happening. We were gaining some traction with the ozone layer. Actually, I live in the West Rand, and I have the opportunity to see a huge part of Johannesburg. And over maybe the first 50 days or 55 days of the lockdown, we've had clear skies every day over Johannesburg. And just in this week, as everybody or most people went back to work, the smog that lingers above the city started to show up again. And I mean, that just shows the impact we have as humanity and how we are contributing to this ecological imbalance. We've seen the different and erratic weather patterns all over the world, the fires in Australia, in the Amazon, in the Okavango. We've seen an increase in zoonotic diseases such as the novel coronavirus, where diseases supposedly skip a species, they move from the animal kingdom and they start to impact humanity. And all of this, has created a mess for all of us. We are sitting in this pandemic. There's issues around income, around earnings, around food security, and just about the survival of humanity. And I want to use this concept to just explain what is happening in terms of the road accident fund and that ecosystem being out of balance. And the reason why it is out of balance is because for a long time, we have done this work from an ego-centric perspective. So we are not in an ecosystem, we're in an ecosystem which is authoritarian, and there's levels, and certain people can do certain things and others can't, very dualistic, unsustainable as we see, to a large extent self-destructive, unwise, imbalanced, and power-seeking. And because we are coming out of that phase as humanity, what we are seeing in this space of earnings, in this space of claims, of road accident fund claims in particular, is, headlines that are coming out in the news. And I mean, I literally went and looked at news headlines in the past 3 months, and these are some of the headlines that showed up. A former attorney still, has not paid a disabled man 12 years on. He's still blocking payments. All right. So we have heard about cases where claimants do not receive all of their money, or they're given small amounts or stipends on a monthly basis. And these cases are everywhere. And I often wonder, how are we contributing to this ecosystem imbalance in this space of medical legal claims? We've seen claims, of people, overseas people, like that stunt woman, I think she was from the UK, who was seeking millions from the road accident fund. The road accident fund has come out, and we all know, if you work in the system and if you've been in the system for a long time, like myself, I think I still have invoices unpaid from as far back as 2015, 2016. 4 or 5 years back, invoices have still not paid, and we continue to submit and resubmit, and they say they are not broke, but they're not paying, and they themselves have a bill of about 17 billion. The thousands of cases that are currently on hold because of the pandemic, and others that have been finalized but are yet to be paid. The narrative around the lawyers that are raking up quite a huge bill in terms of their claims as part of this ecosystem that we are in. The road accident fund, I think over the years, and having worked with them, and they've had CEO upon CEO, and every CEO has come up and said, I want to clean up, I want to cut costs, and I want to do everything. And I mean, the worst for me was when I personally received a letter that says, we know that we owe you money, but please do not take us to court over it. Do not sue us, because there is nothing more to attach. There is nothing left to attach. in fact, you are creating a problem for us as an institution by suing us because we have to settle your legal costs and we are already, not in a good space financially. And then obviously one of the other headlines was that there's a huge shakeup for rough claims. And I think the other narrative that has been going on has been the RABS bill, that has almost been approved or gone through the legislation or parliament processes for approval, which recommended a whole new way of doing road accident fund claims. I think it's still on the table. It's probably still being refined, but the narrative around that has always been that it's quite unfair and it does not serve the purpose of which the fund was established to do. So going back to my geography lesson, what we are seeing here is a very clear ecosystem imbalance or ecological imbalance in the space of earnings data, in the space of road accident and third-party claims. And for me, it is important that we then begin to have this conversation within a broader context, understanding what is happening at a higher level. Now, coming back to the earnings realities of South Africa, I picked up these stats. It comes from Statistics South Africa from Q4 of the previous year, 2019, where we were told that the average worker is paid 22,500 rand per month in South Africa. And, obviously equating to about an annual income of 270,000 rand per year. And yes, this is stats. How do we use the stats? What is the reality around these particular statistics? So my experience shows that when you are looking at some of these sources, you constantly need to keep yourself in check in terms of the ecosystem and say, what does this really mean? Who do I know that fits in this category of the average worker in South Africa? And I think for a lot of people on this call sitting here, you probably agree that you don't know many people that earn an average salary that much. A lot of people are probably sitting lower. And you don't have to go far to confirm that. The South African Revenue Service always tells us that they have between 5 million and 7 million people that contribute to the pay as you earn. So these are people obviously over a wider range that would form part of this statistic of the average salary. That's only 7 million people of a country of 55, 60 million people, and maybe a good, half, 40% of that are people that are employed and are participating in the economy. So who does this, data, which is credible, which comes from, our national statistics, South Africa, hopefully very scientific, and maybe let me not say hopefully, but rather scientific data. How do you begin to use this information knowing that the reality is different, right? And we've got experts here that are going to tell us about earnings and how they get to calculate that. I'm not an expert in that. And I'm saying, this is how I see things from where I sit. I often ask myself these deeper questions to say, who are these people? Is this really the average? And where are the rest of the people? And how do I calculate their earnings? Now, we've also seen a lot of literature around the shadow economy, and it has had very many names. Other people call it the informal sector. Other people call it, the third economy. Other people call it the shadow economy. Again, Statistics South Africa tells us that about 3 million people work in this informal sector, which accounts for about 20% of total employment. So it's not a lot of people. But again, looking at what this quarterly labor force survey really tells us, we need to weigh it against the reality on the ground. It's been criticized in terms of it misrepresenting the real size and the shape of the informal sector in South Africa. If you take the fact that about 80% of people in South Africa are not necessarily in the formal economy, obviously then those stats start to look a little bit dodgy. What I'm saying is that chances are there are much more people that are working in the informal sector. And I know that because in my practice, I have seen quite a lot of people. I keep saying to people, I don't know if they have the same range of cases as well. But if I were to put my range of cases that I usually deal with, I would say that about 80 to 90% are people that are actually in the informal sector, which makes it very, very difficult to calculate their earnings because they are not part of the information that I showed you earlier that comes from Statistics South Africa. Neither are they part of this 3 million people that we spoke about. And then another issue that comes up around the shadow economy is the fact that the vast majority of people who are in this informal sector, about 73% of them, and well below the SARS income tax threshold of 79,000 rand. So they are never accounted for. We don't count them because they are not in the system, you know, where they pay tax, and we can count them and we can include them in this statistics. So it shows that we are missing out quite a lot of people. And another thing that we need to take into consideration around the shadow economy, you know, came from, I think it's the accounting association, you know, ACCA, and at a global level, and they were doing projections about shadow economies, and they were saying that in South Africa, this shadow economy will be about 23, or will contribute about 23, 24% of our GDP by 2020. So these were studies done in 2017, projecting to this year, which obviously has turned out to be completely different. And maybe they're not wrong. Actually, if you think about the pandemic and how it has impacted people and how people are beginning to respond to it from a sustenance perspective, you know, I know of industrial psychologists who are now selling PPE just to make a living. So there are many other people that are participating in this shadow economy in one way or another. So hopefully as the year ends and as we wrap up and we come out of the pandemic, studies will be done to see how these projections were impacted by the pandemic. So there's quite a lot of information around earnings, but at a higher level, you are looking at two things. There's the formal economy and there's the shadow economy. And what part, you know, of the cases that you deal with fall in which category in terms of this earnings components, right? Now, we have a lot of people that come in through our offices. And as I said, about 80 to 90% of the people that I see and the cases that I get to deal with are people that are in the informal economy. During assessment, we hear lots and lots of stories. And now some of these stories, you cannot equate them, or you cannot use the scientific formal economy earnings data that you can to kind of place them, because they are not. I just want to share just a few cases that I had. And my favorite one that I always share is the guy who came in and said, well, I used to be a banana hawker, sell bananas, and I would make 3,000 rand per day. And you know, you find the most respectful and humble ways to say to these people, you know, that this information is going to go to court and we are going to need proof of some of these earnings. And you know, I was actually sitting there jealous. I was like, I would be happy to make 3,000 rand a day from just selling bananas, until I drilled down, which is one of the skills that you need to have as an industrial psychologist. And this guy, as he explained to me how he exactly makes this money, and it was a simple story. He goes to farms, buys bananas in bulk, and he goes and he sells to the informal sector, you know, the ladies that sells at schools, that sell at taxi ranks. And he had mapped out a whole geographical area. And from Monday to Friday, he did indeed deliver bananas that made him a gross income of 3,000 rand per day. Now, there was no proof. And, you know, there was no proof that you would expect would be admissible in court. And I remember one of the things that we had to do is to go back and trace some of his sales from the farms he claimed to buy from. Lucky they kept records and we were able to see how much he used to buy per day. And then he had a book where he kept information of the people that he sold to that could not pay him on time. And all of that information was then used to confirm this 3,000 rand per day. Just the other day, I dealt with a public service driver. And as I say public service driver, this person is a driver in the public service system, earning a gross of about 11,000, 12,000 rand per month. And but his total actual earnings were 120,000 rand, because he had what they call a side hustle, but it was a very big side hustle. It was a tavern, a very busy tavern. He had a brick making business, so he made and sold bricks on the side. And he had also built around 20 rooms that he rents out to people near the mining area in the place where he stays. And all in all, this guy made 120,000 rand. And a huge chunk of his side hustle had been impacted by the accident. I've seen donkey cart drivers and cattle headers who make 10,000 Rand per month. And some of these people are people who rightfully should be in the system, should be part of the South African Revenue Service, should be paying income tax, but they're not. They're out there, we don't count them because they are not in the formal system where we can say, what's our education? And based on your educational level, these are your earnings or projected earnings and so on and so forth. The donkey cart driver and the kettle header both had primary school education, but they were making on average 10,000 Rand per month and they could prove it. One of my other favorite cases where, there are blurred lines around earnings. Was of an artisan, a qualified artisan that had been in an accident, and after the accident, you obviously couldn't work. I think it was a boiler maker, and the organization or the company he worked for decided, well, we're gonna make you a manager of all the boiler makers, so you'll be responsible for planning and scheduling and reporting, and just the overall management. And his salary went down from probably a gross of about 40,000 Rand per month because he was an artisan with a scarce skill, and he went into a management role where down from 40,000 all the way down to 11,000 Rand per month. So this is quite a, it's not a field that you can come in and say there's just one way of doing things. You really need to open yourself up to the understanding of the background information that you're given by this claimant. So nothing is really set in stone in this particular field of earnings. I've had an incident of, many incidents where I was working for defense, and I do both plaintiff and defense, where we have staged careers, where somebody who, did not manage to complete a matric, was presented as somebody who was going to achieve greatness and get into medicine. I mean, my favorite case is of a mother who came with a child that had a pre-existing learning disabilities. And the mother was saying, no, but my child was going to be a medical doctor. And we have seen all of those cases. We have seen family businesses creating fake earnings and fake employment history for claimants. I've experienced all of that. I have worked with an international consultant who had been on a short-term project in South Africa, and because of the scarce skill that he was bringing only for a short period of time, we paid him a lot of money. And how do you project? And because when I looked at his history before he came into South Africa, he didn't even earn half of the money he was making on the project in South Africa. So how do you begin to project realistically about his future if he's going to finish this project and go back to his country and probably go back to earning a third or half of what he was earning in the country? We've had issues around the types of questions that we ask as industrial psychologists. My favorite other example is when people come and you ask them, have you worked? And they say to you, no, I've never worked. Because their concept of work is having a job that has a pay slip and that pays you money and whatever. And what we call in South Africa peace jobs, and they have many other names that we use in our native languages that we refer to. We call them peace jobs, we call them itoho, we call them, you need to be so tuned in with that type of profile of person that you ask them the right question. Because when you ask the question, that's when you begin to hear the story of the donkey cart driver. A cattle header, for example, might not see himself as being employed, because probably in our eyes, he just follows cattle the whole day and makes sure that they get food and they get water and they come back safely to where they are. But this particular cattle header, for example, worked for quite a number of families, and he did a collective cattle heading. He was heading for 10 families, and each family paid him 1,000 Rand a month. So you need to go back, drill down, ask the right question, find out about the language. If you have people that are coming through, you don't speak their language, you don't understand their background, their cultural, find somebody that can help you to understand that. And the one thing that I find is a downfall for most of us is our bias factors, affinity bias that comes through and creeps through. I tend to think because I grew up in a township and I'm African, I understand Africans. And, and the contrary is also, or the opposite is also the same. I mean, we tend to think that we understand our people better. And again, how do you remain fair? Because when people are sent to you, they're not sent to you on the basis of your cultural or racial profile. They are sent to you because they are claimants and you are expected to be fair. So how do we make sure that we have and collect information at a level that, will make a fair and just case for the claimant. You know, we are not cutting corners, we are not, you know, listening to one side of the story, but we are understanding and presenting a comprehensive case. Other realities that we find is that there are people who just don't have a record of earnings and they've survived. I mean, the fact that you've had a house, you've fed children, you've taken children to school. My banana hawker guy told me, I have a house that I've built for cash. I've got a car that I've bought for cash from the business that I used to run. And I've taken 2 kids to not only any university, to the University of Cape Town. And I paid cash for them. And that obviously says to you that this person has been able to you know, afford that particular lifestyle, regardless of the fact that they do not have said earnings data. All right, so those are some of the cases that I thought I should share. Now, moving on to the real psyche, and I say this tongue in cheek, all of us have money on our minds, you know. The road accident fund, for example, you know, if you're talking about the psyche and where we are at, they collect money, you know, obviously from the treasury and through petrol and through other ways of whatever ways that they're collecting this money. And what they really aim to do is to have an effective and efficient fund administration. Obviously, the fund, there's acts and legislation that support the reason why it was fund, and that's what they're there for. If you look at them wanting,
you have
sorry?
1 minute left. You have
oh
1 minute left. Yes.
Okay, cool.
So just to wrap up. Yes.
I will wrap up quickly. Now, if you look at how they're doing that versus the current reality, they come short. The attorneys, I often say their aim is to serve justice or not. Looking at maximum payout at what cost? And I'm sure a lot of us can tell you stories of attorneys who says, no, let's make a case. All right, beware of that. As experts, we are expected to give a fair assessment, opinions, projections, calculations with the assistance of actuaries. But a lot of us are also looking at getting more instructions. You know, we obviously want to get paid, but are we looking at real-time profitability for hard work put in or easy money? And as for claimants, they're looking for justice, they're looking for reparations, and a lot of them, if you talk to them, they actually think they're going to get millions and they don't know how they're going to get millions. So we are working at tightrope in terms of, you know, equality, fair rights, justice, ethics, balance, and all of that. Now, we have taken an oath as industrial psychologists where we are responsible for promoting and balance and societal prosperity and human flourishing. You know, we need to be responsive to the economy. We need to think ourselves as part of the economy. And I mean, we are contributing to the road accident fund. So how we do things must not be influenced by pockets and wealth and money that we can't. We also take an oath as we sit there to uphold and protect the Constitution and the rights of the people that we write reports for. So we need to remember that, and this is, I think, my last slide, that we are part of this ecosystem. When we do work, when we are seeking information from our claimants and from everybody, we need to remember that we are part of this ecosystem. Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it nicely. He says, if you are looking to loot and to enrich yourself unfairly, you are actually stealing from your own household. And that's how I see it. It's important that we understand the South African socio-economic context. And when we don't know, we ask, because nobody knows everything. Ask the claimant, ask other aspects, do your industry research. And the claimant is your first point of call. So those people are not there at our mercy. They are actually sources of information and we need to use it. I believe that sharing knowledge is power, like we are doing here. I have many people that have come to me and says, well, I don't know anything about medico-legal, and I've shown them for free. Sharing knowledge is power. This pie is huge and there's enough for everyone, and we need to work together. I know this is work in progress, but we are talking about standardizing best practice. And again, as the rest of the presenters and the panelists are going to show us, we need to invest in credible earnings data sources. I saw a question, and I think we can deal with the questions at a later stage, but I saw a question asking, do we only use one source? No, you don't use one source. You can use multiple sources. And I think at one point when we started working, we used to come together with other experts and say, let us contribute to buying, you buy that source and I buy that source of data and I buy that source of data, and we can share information, and that's how we grow. And of course, I would always say to people, join your communities of practice as they're listed there and be part of it. And as we do that, we remember that we are an ecological system that needs to be balanced at all times, and we work together. And my last quote to you, let us learn, unlearn, and relearn. as Alvin Toffler said. So be always willing to learn. I'm going to sit in this call for the rest of the session, because even after many years of doing this work, I believe that there's many things that I still need to learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manoko, for such an enlightening conversation. I think for me, what really sticks out is, are we taking the time to do due diligence as experts working in this field of medical legal? And, you know, there's lots to think about. Your questions on the chat, colleagues, are noted and will be addressed at the end of the session. And some of your questions might be answered by some of the panelists. So we want to give everyone an opportunity, you know, to share their thoughts. So while Charles is getting ready, just some quick highlights from Manoko around understanding the ecosystem that we are working in, that we are part of that ecosystem. We are not removed from it. So we need to look at our reality. Yes, we have all these different earnings data available, but are we asking the right questions? Are we taking the time to dig a little bit deeper? Are we aware of our own biases that would interrupt our ability, you know, to ask questions and to understand? I see, Charles, you're ready. Are you ready to kick off? Great. Thank you so much, Manoko. And we're handing over to Charles, who is an actuary at Monroe Forensic Actuaries. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. Let me just share my screen, and you should be able to see some fish at the moment. And
yes,
sorry,
we can see the fish.
Okay.
Yes. Show your screen briefly.
Yeah, that was the last slide though. So now, okay, so now I'm on the first slide.
Yes.
Thanks for the introduction, Sharon, and also Manoko, very good presentation. Thank you for that. I hope we can empower industrial psychologists to make sense of earnings data to use in their projections for both the uninjured and the injured states, of course. Okay, and then as you know, just some lighthearted animal banter to start off with. I hope it's a welcome break from the facts, stats, and jokes about the coronavirus that you've seen recently. And I also hope that my qualifications are not completely irrelevant. Okay, so there's a picture of me sometime before self-isolation. As you can tell, if you can see my video. My wife refuses to cut my hair. I haven't tried to do so myself, and I've also resorted to growing myself a waterproof face mask to wear when I'm surfing. So things are looking good for my Santa aspirations for the year-end office Zoom party, I think. Now, on to my qualifications. I am an actuary, and I've started my career at Old Mutual. I've also worked some years in London, and I've been with Monroe Actuaries since 2009. So I've seen thousands of IP reports by now, both plaintiff and defendant side. Okay, so on my agenda today, I just want to touch on those 3 items. To start with just some basic statistics, so to make sure that everybody is on the same page, you know, with regards to the statistical concepts when the next people might go into more detail. And then just going to look at the impact of using different data sets. So basically understanding how seemingly similar input can give widely different results. And then perhaps some of the other panelists can also comment on, on these differences and, and which source could be applicable in which case. And then lastly, I'm going to focus on the earnings data that we as actuaries require to calculate claims. So with the road accident fund's recent focus on mediation and settlement, we feel there might be many more joint minutes coming up. So I'm also just going to cover, the type of stuff that we need to see in a joint minute. The clarity. Yeah, essentially we need clarity on what is agreed and what is not. Okay, on to the first slide then. Let me just enable my laser pointer as well. So here you have the number of people. This is an example earnings distribution. And now this could be any hypothetical earnings distribution. We could call it a Patterson B1 or C1 or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But the data is then typically ordered from the lowest earners to the highest earners, and then divided into 4 quarters by these 3 lines. So these 3 vertical lines, is sometimes called quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3. Quartile 2 is mostly called the median, quartile 1 and 3, upper or lower. We also see the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, the 75th percentile. So these are all terms that's being used to basically denote these lines. And basically this method is used to exclude outliers that falls here below quartile 1 or above quartile 3. As you can perhaps see as well, we call this a skewed distribution. So the tail is fatter, which means there's more higher earners, and they would also distort the average. So therefore, the median is not the average, and you can see it's also not the data point where the most people earn. It's simply the point where 50% of your people earn less than this point, and 50% earns more. Which means that it's often the best indication to use for earnings. Now, obviously, some people can be outliers, and some data sets will also show a 90th percentile. This might lie somewhere around here. Anybody can, of course, be an outlier, but just note that you'd probably expect only one person, well, not probably, you definitely expect one person to earn above the 90th percentile out of a typical data set. And then lastly, just a comment that the Patterson model should refer to job specifications and not earnings. So for example, if somebody is earning at this level, it's still possible that he is on this Patterson grading. Alternatively, it could be a median on a higher Patterson grading. But for more detail on this, how to classify the earnings onto Patterson's, there's a workshop by Barbara Donaldson that we can recommend that you take a look at. Okay, then I'm going to just show you some Patterson figures. So this slide here on the left, I've got the Stats SA Quantum Yearbook Basic and Quantum Yearbook Total. So the Quantum Yearbook ones, obviously the Koch's Quantum Yearbook. I'm just showing these here since this is the only one that we subscribe to. All the other surveys we only see when we encounter them in industrial psychologist reports. So I'm also only showing the medians here for comparison. And then what I show you on the right is if you divide them by each other. So it's Stats SA divide by Quantum Basic or likewise for the total package. So as you can see, there's quite a smooth progression when you move the total package from the basics. As you go up to the higher grades, and this is perhaps expected as you have more variable pay. Then if you look at the Stats SA, it starts at very close to the same at the A1 level, but then drops to only 50% by the D level and only a quarter by the E levels. So so there could be many possible reasons for this, and I'm hoping that some of the other panelists might expand on that. But it could be along the lines of the survey questions from Stats SA might be misunderstood. People could say, quote their pre or post tax salaries. They might not accurately account for fringe benefits such as pension, medical aids, bonuses, or other variable earnings. Again, I defer to other panelists perhaps to comment on that. Then the next slide is the same data essentially, but just on a graphical representation for those that prefer pictures to numbers. I've just excluded the total package because the pattern was quite stable, but this allows us to see the pattern more clearly, and then you can see again for the E levels how much higher the red bars are, which is the Quantum Yearbook Basic salaries compared to the Stats SA, which was categorized into the Patterson levels. Okay, and then this is a table that we see being used quite a lot. And especially for minors, where multiple earning scenarios are then suggested based on the possible qualification that they might have achieved if uninjured. So we call this the NQF to Patterson model. In the next few slides, I'll just refer to this as the NQF to Patterson model. And I've just used the various entry and ultimate levels for the various levels of education that I'm going to show you. Okay, and then the other one is this table that you've probably also seen in Koch's Quantum Yearbook. We call this the Stats SA by earnings by age and level of education table. So now obviously this then gives us an alternative to the previous model where where you don't have Patterson, so like you can see there's no Patterson levels here, but it's simply organized here by level of education, and I've only shown these four, and then for each there's a couple of ages. And so just note that this is the 2019 table if any of you are looking at your current Koch yearbooks, but I have used the 2020 tables in my analysis for the next few slides. And I've also used the formal sector median. So this is the column highlighted that I've used. And then what I'm doing is for each of these, wherever the first data point is, I start the person's career. So for these ones, I start them at age 25, and I straight line them through each level of earnings, and then inflationary from the final point until age 65. And then also worth noting while we're here is that this category simply says less than grade 12. So on the following slide, I'll have some more comments on that as well. Okay, so this is a graphical illustration of a typical career, and I've just picked the certificate level of earnings. So this graph just needs some explanation perhaps. So this is the monthly level of earnings in current terms. So everything here is in 2020 terms. The red line is our date of calculation, and this is for a 15-year-old female that will then enter essentially in 10 years' time at age 25, given that it's a certificate level, and that's the first earnings point that we have for Stats SA. So the gray line here is the representation of the age and level of education model by Stats SA. So that's the earnings, and then the NQF Patterson model is then almost double the career. So this then represents the straight line from the entry to the ceiling, and this represents inflationary increases until the retirement age. So just bear those concepts in mind when I show you some graphs later on as well. Okay, and then for each level of education, for each of those four that I've considered here, I've just calculated the value of a typical career, again for the 15-year-old female. So this is now after tax, mortality, and discounting, but without contingencies. So the red bars again is the NQF to Patterson models. So that's the value of the careers, of essentially of a lifetime's worth of earnings from age either 20 or 25 until 65 for somebody that's now age 15. So you can see for most models, or for most earnings levels, most qualification levels, the NQF model gives almost double the answer. But for the grade 10 one, it gives about 4 times the answer. And that just brings me to the previous point. The Stats SA by level of education only says less than grade 12. So perhaps the range is too wide. It probably then covers everybody. Well, it must then cover everybody that has a grade 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 10, any grade less than grade 12. So perhaps from that point of view, that category could be less useful to use. And then the other point worth noting perhaps is that moving from a grade 10 to a grade 12 doesn't have a seemingly very big impact on the value of a career, at least, but perhaps perhaps you'd expect somebody like with a grade 12 to have more stable careers and therefore less periods of unemployment, and the attorneys might then take that into account in the level of contingencies that they apply. And then just another comment on contingencies. Obviously, if multiple scenarios for a minor is suggested, and it's quite it's possible that somebody may have gotten a degree, it's always good to also suggest the alternative degree, the alternative qualification if they do not achieve the degree level of education, because as you can see, if you value a degree and then apply contingencies, you still won't get anywhere close to perhaps if they only enter the labor market with a grade 12 level of education. So unless you're going to apply over 50% contingencies. Okay, and then this slide is quite a busy slide, but many of you may have seen it recently. My colleague and Dean and I have worked on this earnings assistant for quite a while, and this then is the final item of my agenda. It touches on the earnings data required to calculate claims. So many of you may have seen our paper versions of tables that we've asked you to complete over the years. We've then decided to take this online and add some of the functionality with graphs and the like. So I hope some of you have seen either the email or Dean's presentation earlier. That's also on YouTube. Otherwise, if you haven't, and you can also see the link there at the bottom right where you can find it. So what is the earnings assistant? It's a free-to-use online platform that enables industrial psychologists to easily convert the narrative of a case into a logical basis for calculation. It allows for the accurate comparison of different income streams and fringe benefits from various monetary periods, and provides a concise visual summary of the findings, acting as a logic check. And with the logic check, we essentially also mean the graph, which I'll show you a bit more in detail in the next few slides. And There's also a printable summary that can be attached to the final medico-legal report to be used by the actuary to quantify. So from the tool, you can press an export button, and you can then copy it either as an attachment into your report or into the main body of your report, both the tables and the graphs that I'm going to show you. So also, just to note that many IPs over the last few months have helped us test this, so it's been properly tested. We've taken a lot of their feedback into account, and we thank you for that. And we also encourage any further feedback that you might have that will help us to improve this. So you might also ask, why did we do it? I think also, linking into Manoko's presentation, we all know about the Road Accident Fund's financial situation and the looming RABS system, perhaps. So, so we all know that they perhaps need more clarity. Everybody in the stream, from us, down to the attorneys and the advocates. And having more clarity, we believe will lead to faster and more realistic settlements. And faster settlements will also mean that all of us gets paid sooner. And I don't think you need an actuary to tell you that being paid sooner is worth more than being paid later if it's the same amount that you're getting paid. Okay, so so basically what we want to do is we want to encourage industrial psychologists to provide all the necessary figures that we need to calculate. Otherwise, we either have to make assumptions or defer the case, for more information. All right. So then, this is a screenshot of the uninjured table. So what would have happened ignoring the accident until retirement age 65? You can change the retirement age there. So this is a screenshot. Like I've said, the output will show more detail, and it will also show references to each line so that you can refer to this in your reports or when doing joint minutes. It's then easy to comment on which item or line item you might agree or disagree on with the other industrial psychologists. So the idea is to have a line for each point where the earnings differs. And then these are the tables, the columns that we've also, that we need to calculate the claims. So starting from the date and the age, you can enter either, and the tool will show you the other one. The amount, self-explanatory. The frequency, you'd be surprised how often the frequency is omitted in the body of reports when earnings are simply relayed, but the frequency is left out. Terms, I'll just explain a little bit more. That's essentially the time value of the money. So here you can see May 2015, and the comment is actual earnings payslip. So it's cut off here just to fit onto the screen, but on the tool again, you will see the whole comment if you hover over it. So the payslip was 2015, which means the terms of this earnings, was 2015. The next comment says manager benefits. So this perhaps was an interview with the claimant's previous manager. Terms 2020 means it was probably done when the assessment was done. And then finally a Patterson level. So and the increases, either earnings inflation or straight line. And those are the typical increases that we see being used. And then right here you can see CTC, that stands for cost to company. So these two illustrates that there's benefits, and I'll show you the benefits in the next screen. This one doesn't have benefits because it's a total package, but if it wasn't a total package, you could click there to add benefits. So essentially what we aim is for industrial psychologists to agree on a data set to use in joint minutes to avoid different results. So I've very often seen a joint minute, and then we do a calculation, and the other actuary then also does the calculation, and our results differ substantially. And that's mostly because either the Patterson level, wasn't specified, whether it's basic or total package or which quartiles. The ages or dates wasn't clearly stated. Also note that you can give us an age or a date range. It doesn't have to be an exact age. But if you do give us a range, we'll just use the middle most likely, because we don't have any other idea than using the middle perhaps. Okay, and then also important to note that you must compare earnings from the correct year for your own analysis and like-for-like salaries. So this is a total package. So this total package cannot be compared to this, which is a basic salary. And also this is 2015 terms, and these two are 2020 terms. So they're not comparable like-for-like. So it's important whenever you compare payslips to surveys to make sure that it's, either you adjust for inflation, which the tool can do for you, which we'll show just now, or you do, yeah, you just bear it in mind. And also same for the for fringe benefits. Okay, so then if you click on the benefit screen, this will pop up. It's we call it the fringe benefit screen. So you can see you can add some common fringe benefits like 13th check, retirement contributions. You can the employee and the employer contributions. You can add either a percentage or an amount, and it'll calculate the other one, and then you can save and exit. So here you can see the total cost is 38 and the basic salary was only 27. So in this case, it adds about 40% to the earnings. So it's important to attach values to all fringe benefits. Otherwise, we cannot value them. So if you simply state that the claimant had pension or medical aid from the employer, but there's no values, then we can't calculate it. So like you can see, you can enter any amount and you can see the impact on the total cost to company immediately.
1 minute left, Charles.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, I'm almost done, luckily. Okay, and then, yeah, this is almost my final slide. So this is the graph that you can see at any point when you click on the graph, or if you scroll to the bottom of the earnings assistant. So so this is the career history. So here's the legend at the bottom: career history, injured and uninjured. And the lines we have for the accident and for date of calculation today. So you can see the pattern that the claimant had before the career, before the accident, seems to be quite similar. That's being projected to the career ceiling. So this helps with your logic check. Sometimes we see a very steep pattern here, compared to what happened before, which then could perhaps indicate a lower career ceiling or a delay, perhaps. You can also see this early retirement, the injured stops. You can also see the person just got a job quite recently. So basically in one place, you can see everything about your history, your uninjured and your injured progressions. And not now, because this is a slide, but in the tool, if you hover over any earnings point, you can see the current values as well. So even if you had a payslip year in 2010, and you hover there, you will see how much is that worth in today's terms in 2020. So, okay. And then just my final slide, just skip over this quite quickly though. It's just some common issues that we see with Patterson careers. So this is a quote that we've seen in a report a while back. I'm not going to read it now to save time, but you can do so. There's two main issues here: the H45 and the C5. So and here I'm displaying just the rules how a SAPS officer's career progression would work. So there's various levels that they would go through, being 3 years on each notch, and there's rules for how soon they can move between levels. So therefore, typical ages and typical Patterson models do not fit, do not fit government workers, because they have particular scales with fixed increases and published notches that you can use. Okay, and that is it for me. And there is my contact details and our team. If you want to have, if you have any comments or questions, Dean or I can help you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charles. I think you're expanding our thinking very much around understanding what you need from your side as actuaries. And one key takeaway while Robert is getting his slides ready is that we need to clarify the more detail that's available, it helps everyone in the value chain. And once we're clear, it means we all get paid on time. So don't assume, the other person understands what you're saying. And it has to be logical. It has to make sense. Because if we are experts of the court is relying on our expertise as earnings experts to tell them how we arrived at a particular place.
Yeah,
so
just a final point on that. Sorry, I forgot to say is that, like I said, in the joint minutes, we often then get asked to do a joint minute as actuaries because our results differ. But our results differ because the input wasn't clear enough. And then time and again, we see cases being postponed, which means us, the industrial psychologists, the attorneys, and most importantly, the claimant, all then wait for their money if the case gets postponed. So that's why we want to encourage clarity so that, that there's less litigation and faster settlements.
Great, thank you. And there's some questions for you on the chat. So what we've resolved to do, if there are any questions that are able to be typed out, the panel are welcome to type as we go along. And any of the questions that are responded to live, we can do that at the end. Okay. Robert, are you ready to go on?
Yeah, I think so. I'm clicking on my slides. There's a little thing. Is it showing up on the screen?
Not yet, not
There's
yet.
a little thing which I should be clicking on, the little box there. I've clicked on it, but nothing seems to be happening.
Okay, I also have your slides, which I can share if that will work.
I updated them a little bit, so it'd be
Oh,
nice to
okay.
have the latest ones on.
Okay.
Now, am I in? That's what's bothering me.
We see your screen with your name, but we don't have the slides yet, and we don't have your video
I
yet.
can't see that screen. Should I say start video?
Yes, you can do that. And when you hover at the bottom, you should see.
Yes.
So this is Robert, for those who've never seen him.
No,
When you hover at the bottom,
come up. Why is
there's the share screen. That little green button at the bottom.
Yeah, at the bottom, but it's the green button.
Yes, that share screen. If you hover your mouse, you should be able to see it.
Share screen, share. Stop video, mute.
It's on that tab. There's that share screen. It's a green one with an arrow.
Oh, there's a green one, right? I'm clicking on it.
Yes, great.
Right.
And then it should give you different tabs, and you pick your presentation. Yes, there you go. Awesome. Okay, and then just so get into screen mode, into PowerPoint mode. Yes, that one. No, the next one. Just move to your left a little bit.
Yeah, that one.
Yes, that one. Oh no, it's just click anywhere outside of that. Okay, yes, that one. Yes, you got it. Okay, awesome. Over to you.
Right. Well, first slide is introducing myself. I've been doing actuary assessments for about 40 years. And I started out with an actuary qualification, and then I also did a law qualification. I did a doctorate in law in the issue as to whether the loss is for earning capacity or loss of earnings. I've published 2 books, Damages for Lost Income in 1984, and then there was my thesis, which was published in 1993. The thesis text is all available on my website. Here you are, robertjkoch.com. And then we published the Quantum Yearbook. Now, my emphasis here, I found Charles was really very complimentary to what I wanted to say, and I was delighted with what he had to say. And what I now want to comment is on a lot of legal aspects and also actuarial aspects, but one of the first things I say is the reports of industrial psychologists are used to determine damages for personal injury, and they're now occasionally used in loss of support claims. Most claims against the Road Accident Fund, but we also get claims for medical negligence, police shootings, and a whole variety of other accidents, dog bites. For an injury claim, the claim is for loss of earnings, and not just likely earnings. That means having regard to the chances that the earnings would have been earned if he hadn't been injured. And the difference is that they then do a calculation of likely earnings now that he's injured, and the difference is what is awarded with an adjustment for general contingencies. A lot of attorneys don't properly understand the difference between earning capacity and loss of earnings, so they use the words rather interchangeably, which can be a bit confusing for industrial psychologists who are looking for guidance as to what to do. The problem with earning capacity is best illustrated by a hotel. A hotel with 100 rooms has an earning capacity of renting out all 100 rooms all the time. That is earning capacity for the hotel. Likely earnings for the hotel is they may run at 60 rooms on average being filled through the seasons. And that is the likely earnings of the hotel. Now, this applies very much to claimants as well. Many of them have the capacity to do wonderful things, but how likely is it that they'll achieve that, having regard to the economy, the particular circumstance of the individual? So I emphasize this point because I know there's a lot of confusion, and very few attorneys seem to be clear on the difference between the two. For death claims, again, it's likely earnings of the deceased. Most death claims are dealt with using an earning certificate from the employer or a payslip. Industrial psychologists are very seldom used. Sometimes the wife would have been working, and regard has to be had to her likely earnings. She won't be dead, she'll be still alive. And the law gets quite complicated in this area, because things like if the wife was doing one job before the death and then she changes jobs, the law says that you must have regard to what she would have earned if she stayed in the job that she had when he died. So there's little things like this to complicate it. The children are normally assumed to become self-supporting as soon as they start working. So what they actually earn is not required. It's the only time when you might have a child's earnings brought into account is when they are disabled children who remain dependent for the lifetime of the deceased. And that child might have a small earning capacity which may need to be brought into account, but that's a very rare instance. And so I emphasize that the emphasis is on likely earnings, and the Quantum Yearbook, page 124, can give you the case references for why likely earnings is the issue and not earning capacity. No, what have I done? I've gone backwards. No. A division is needed between past earnings and future earnings. A lot of industrial psychologists tend to concentrate on the future, but it's very important for quantification that we have good details of the past earnings, and that can be quite complicated with job hopping and various things. The actual earnings, having regard to the injury, is usually the most difficult, because victims go in and out of jobs and remain unemployed for periods. And I heard one advocate say the statement, "Please don't confuse me with facts." But yes, and unfortunately, that's detail which we really do need. And an aspect of this detail, which is my bottom line, is that we need, it's not enough to just say the salary was such and such. You really, industrial psychologists often gloss over the fringe benefits. And fringe benefits can be very little and can be substantial to the point of more than 50% of the package. Pension, medical aid, overtime, housing. A common one which gets overlooked is when the victim had free housing at the mine, or quite a number of policemen get free housing at police establishments, and those often get left out. But because it doesn't really appear on the payslip, but it's a benefit that he is getting. And we need RAND values. Not enough to say, oh, he got medical aid and pension. You have to say he got pension of 8% of his basic salary, that being the employer's contribution. What the individual contributes is not quite that. Then going up to the second paragraph, these reports that the reports that industrial psychologist prepares leads to calculating a lump sum amount to be awarded for damages. And every IP report should include recommendations for actuary tables. The industrial psychologists will do well to apply their mind to how the actuary is going to read their report. And Charles has put to you the earnings assistant that Monroe is making available, and that provides a very detailed summary. I will give you a slightly more abridged summary, which is also acceptable. One does, and I will there discuss an aspect which is omitted from the Monroe computer analysis. Something perhaps worth mentioning at this point in time is that in the days before industrial psychologists, and I was working for many years in that, the courts would only work with a pay slip or an earnings certificate, and it was usual to bring the employer to court to testify as to promotions and increases. What the Road Accident Fund has noted that in more recent years, their claims experience in real terms for loss of earnings has gone up by a factor of 500%, 5 times. And that is the effect of the industrial psychologists on the claims experience of the Road Accident Fund. So when industrial psychologists are doing their figures, they might just like to reflect on that, particularly having regard to Monoko's comments earlier about being environmentally aware. Now.
So you have 3 minutes left, Rob.
Okay, well then let's quickly go past earnings, future earnings, right. Retirement ages. A lot of industrial psychologists say age 60 to 65. Most actuaries will take that to mean age 62 and a half. But the Sanlam Employee Benchmark Survey shows that the majority of fund members retire between 63 and 65. And so we do use an age 64, which I think is more reasonable. And again, now, age 60 is compulsory for uniformed government services, army and police, and some of the banks. And it's well worth asking what the retirement age is at the employment where the victim was, because sometimes that gives guidance as to what to do. Here's a thing about linear increases. The actuaries knee-jerk to a compound rate of increase. Industrial psychologists have emphasized that the linear rates of increase probably are more give a better representation. And the reality is that in the early stages of a career, progress is probably a lot faster than linear. In my red line there, or orange line, if you want to call it that. And it is a good idea to not just say from a starting point to a figure at age 45. It's good to give a few figures in between to get the early rate of increase built into the calculation. It does affect the capital result quite a lot. This is a topic on which Charles touched. Job grades are by job content, not by level of remuneration. Too many industrial psychologists make the mistake of taking the earnings and comparing that to the table and saying, oh, well, he was earning at a B3 level. Well, that's not true. The job content should be analyzed and having and then identifying the job grade. And then if you look at the earnings, you can see where in the range he is. Is he an upper quartile? Is he a median? Is he a lower quartile? Now, likely earnings, one can glibly prognosticate that a labourer earning 18,000 a year will then find corporate employment, because the capacity thinking tends to go that way. But in fact, how realistic is that assumption? He might have the capacity, but how likely is it he'll actually achieve that? And application to the percentage chance is definitely a good thing. Here's a little actuary table showing, if you don't want to use Munro's earnings assistant, you can do a simple little thing like this with just a few little steps and the escalation, and then you do a similar one for injured. And here is a column showing the percentage chance of actually the 100, 60, 35, and then fringe benefits built in. So I commend all industrial psychologists to build tables like that into their reports. Quantum Yearbook, I think most of you are familiar with it. We have various tables. I'll get to that quickly. Lockdown. And
one more minute.
How many?
1 minute. One more minute.
The important issue is lockdown. How do we deal with it? And my office is instructed that we will ignore lockdown in doing our calculations and leave the lawyers and others to figure out what adjustment they wish to make. I've got many little pieces here, like general contingencies. There's a whole page on it. Most of what you need to know at page 118 of the Quantum Yearbook. So all industrial psychologists should just read that page to begin with and then send more questions. Now, another one is how do we get our information for the table? It's one of the questions I've done an answer to here. And that is the data, how and where Patterson table, how and where is the data sourced? Well, the answer is by bits and pieces collected from IP and other reports and graduated along with CPI to project likely future earning results for 2020. You must remember that the Quantum Yearbook is an estimate of what the Patterson figures will be in the next year without the survey. And we draw information from industrial psychologist reports mostly, for which we're very grateful. They're very helpful. We get bits and pieces out of court rulings. So it's pieced together in that way. And we've kept fairly good pace with the real Patterson figures over the years. Now, let's see, general contingencies. That was a topic which keeps coming up. Oh, the other thing I'd like to say is most IPs don't seem to know enough about the subject as to precisely the legal aspects. And there's much to be said for your governing body introducing a damages certification requirement before an industrial psychologist can plunge into doing medico-legal reports. I'd also like to say that if you want text on the subject, on my website under the documents library is the full text of my thesis. And there are some chapters worth reading, particularly chapter 13, as regards claims for loss of support. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Robert. Such useful gems that you are sharing, and really such a privilege for SIOPSA to be able to host you. I know you don't take up a lot of these offers due to limited time, so we're very thankful that you were able to slot us in. So please look at his website, check out, all the documents that he's put together. And yeah, we will share the slides once the panel discussion is over. And we're going to hand over to Jan of Analytical HR. So Jan, over to you. Thank you, Ron.
So thank you so much, Sharon, for handing over. It's really great to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation as well. Myself and Morag Philip will be presenting our research together, which may be very useful for IOPs. I think the topic that we're discussing today is very useful, considering all the questions that we've received from our publishing in the Quantum Yearbook. I should just put the disclaimer out there that our research and the Quantum Yearbook is just summary statistics. So our research is far more, it goes beyond that as well, and far more in depth. Yeah, and I've seen a couple of publications this year circulating in the medico-legal environment, where professionals are really now starting to critically think of how to do earnings progressions and earnings projections and so forth. I think just yesterday, Johan Venter released another research study that he did. But I think the topic of today is I'll discuss Analytical's research, and Morag Phillips from 21st Century will discuss their corporate salary survey. Okay. So Analytical started about in 2016. It was a small team of us. Myself, my background is industrial psychology. I'm currently completing my master's thesis in medical legal work. Also a quantitative analyst and economist. So we pride ourselves on being labor market researchers and not just salary data providers. Our research goes very in-depth into demographic variables and how certain variables affect earnings. Also, just to add, the majority of our clientele are industrial psychologists working in the medical legal sphere, largely based in Gauteng. But we also do provide research to career centers at universities, to recruiters, and to insurance companies. I'm also very glad to announce the collaboration between Analytical, which provides Stats SA data to IOPs, and then 21st Century, which is the only audited corporate salary survey in South Africa. So by combining the two forms of research, IOPs really do get a full set and a full view of the labor market. That includes corporate sector data and non-corporate sector data. Okay, so we do not believe that there's a one-size-fits-all data source or earning source out there. I think this speaks to what I've just previously mentioned. Analytica focuses on demographic and labor market research in the non-corporate earnings sector. Our research can be determined by age group, education, occupation, sector, province, race, and gender, to name but a few variables. And then 21st Century provides what IOPs determine as corporate salary surveys with in-depth analysis of set salary structures and benefits. From the demo, from the screenshots that you will see later, you will see that that it provides company structure, company size, earnings by industry, earnings by region, gives you a full breakdown of the total package and the benefits. All of our earnings data can be accessed through online portals. We have two independent systems, and that includes Analytica's earnings app and Reward Online, which is the 21st Century corporate salary data, which can all be accessed through Analytica's website. Okay, before we get started in discussing what research is most applicable where, I think it's very important for industrial psychologists to realize that salary surveys and earnings research, that is tertiary evidence. The most important thing is to understand that the claimant lives in their own unique socioeconomic circumstances. There can't be a generic progression for claimants, unfortunately. Each claimant needs to be assessed based on their own medical issues, psychological factors, their educational history, their work history, and any additional factors that relate to it. And then secondly, your most valuable source of information is your employer. Yes, sure, there are difficult cases where you're dealing with other minors or individuals that are unemployed, but your employment information should build your entire case. Not earnings, not salary surveys, not status A data, not corporate salary data. Your employment collateral should build your case. And that is always very important for industrial psychologists to be aware of. Yeah, okay. So all employment data should also be validated. And this is the realm of the expertise of the IOP, is you need to ask the employer, what is the salary structure in the organization? Or is there a salary structure? Do they pay on minimum wage scales? And you need to tease out all of this information to see what the environment is that the claimant is working in. And only at a later stage, after assessing the claimant and the claimant's employment history and the claimant employer, then do you analyze the labor market research. And that labor market research can be in the form of status A data provided by Analytical or corporate salary data, depending on the claimant's circumstances, once again. And only then can you form an earnings opinion. So this model was created by Dr. Shanazarian, who's based in the US, who's a vocational expert. Okay. So we've seen in many industrial psychology reports that claims are often over-quantified and possibly under-quantified. But the reality is that there's some sort of dissonance that is happening between what industrial psychologists are living in their daily life and what they are reporting claimants to earn. So, as you can see from let's get my laser pointer out, the employer pension contributions. So this is just the analysis that we did on Stats SA data, showing what occupational skill set actually gets employer pension fund contributions. And this type of table will assist you in determining, should I use basic or total package earnings? So for instance, domestic workers, you don't typically see them getting pension funds. Unskilled or elementary occupations, you don't see. When we start discussing semi-skilled occupations, such as plant and machine operators, trade workers, skilled agricultural workers, and so on, there we see a regulation, things starting to regulate around the 50% mark of individuals actually getting pension fund contributions. And only at the skilled and professional levels do we see individuals actually getting those benefits. So as an industrial psychologist, the use of total package earnings should be used once again in context to what the skill level is of the claimant. Another common question that we get is corporate is often used synonymously with formal sector, and that is not the case. Corporate only forms a section of the formal sector. So as you can see, we've done a breakdown of the percentage of employed individuals in each sector, and our informal economy, our agricultural economy, and our private sector or private household workers also form a substantial part of our labor market. And the corporate sector only forms a portion of this formal sector earnings. Another key consideration that industrial psychologists should take into account is the high youth unemployment rate. Now, factors that reduce the likelihood of being unemployed is higher levels of education. However, research done by the Helen Suzman Foundation, for instance, says that the average age of entry into the labor market on full-time employment is 23 years old. So when predicting a minor or somebody at university, there needs to be some type of delay or the IOP needs to take account of the difficult labor market that youth enter into. Morag, would you like to add anything to that?
All good so far, thank you.
Okay. Now, we've also often been asked on why we use Stats SA data. As I've mentioned, we work in the insurance industry and not only in the medico-legal industry, although that is where our passion lies. We find Stats.SA data to be suitable and applicable to the majority of cases which IOPs deal with. So because it provides you with an entire perspective of the labor market and not just a portion of the formal sector, which many structured salary surveys do. So it's, as an IOP, you need to assess what the applicability of the scales are to the claimant and not just assess the scales on its own merits. So some of the topics as to, or points to why we use Stats.SA data, we've covered here. It's generally accepted and used by researchers, academics, and policymakers, and insurers. So that leads me to understand some of the questions that we have received historically is, how do IOPs trust unemployment statistics, but they have got a dissonance with income statistics? Key economic metrics like CPI, population estimates, unemployment rate, and so forth is produced by Stats.SA and commonly used in all sectors of our economy. The data that we use and that Stats.SA does get is valid and reliable. We've received many of those questions, and the reliability and validity is determined by the United Nations benchmarks. And that benchmark is determined by if there's a 5 to 10% degree of error or lack of coverage in the counts or the data that's being collected. And all of this was determined to be less than 5%, making a very good and reliable source of data. Stats.SA data is also governed by legislation, by the Statistics 1999 Act. So that ensures confidentiality of data. It also ensures that the enumerators ask and collect data truthfully, and that the individual should, by all means, answer truthfully. What we are trying to allude to here is that some people have got the perception that Stats.SA data is just purely reported information without any validation, without any statistical practices being followed once the data is collected, and that's simply not the case. For example, independent post-enumerator surveys conducted. Post-enumerator surveys is totally independent, set up by an independent committee of experts, of statisticians, medical doctors, an array of experts, and they actually check whether the census, for instance, was accurately captured by doing a second survey and sample households. Another major benefit is that the data is transparent, it's publicly available, it's a very large repository of data, and that this makes it extremely useful for industrial psychologists to use, because you can go very granular into the data and actually have a look at specific profiles, demographic profiles, or occupational profiles, and what they earn in the labor market. It's not, I believe it's 97 variables that is captured in the data set, which allows us to do cross-sectional analysis based on age, education field, and so forth. All occupations in the data set are classified by the International Labour Organization's classification. The questions that were asked was, what is your occupational title and what are your main tasks? So all of this data is captured by Stats.SA, and then it is classified under the International Labour Organization's codes. And then the most significant benefit to us is that it provides a labour market perspective, and once again, not a section of the formal sector. So just a data overview on the data that we most commonly use, and that is the Census 2011 revised 2015 sample data. It is a total count of the South African population. So once again, it's not a portion of a sector. The data set consists of more than 4.4 million rows and 97 variables. Data quality was assessed by the United Nations, and into the accuracy of reporting measures indicated that data fell within the threshold of high quality data. It provides a realistic perspective of the South African labour market, in our opinion. Okay, to ensure that there are checks and balances in place and that the data is accurately collected. We all know how Stats SA data was collected through the household and labour market surveys. The quarterly employment survey that one of our panel members showed earlier, that is actually based on organizational payroll data. However, the data that we use are enumerators that goes house to house and ask 97 questions in effect. In order to ensure that all of this data is captured accurately, enumerators do receive training. So it's not, and there are logical edits that occur. So if you see, for instance, some people have stated that the data can be captured incorrectly. Firstly, in all data sets, there are variants of area of data that's being captured. But secondly, the enumerators are well trained to spot whether the individual's actually telling the truth. And they do probe with further questions to ensure that the best answers is, or the most accurate answers given. Once again, the data is governed by the Statutory Law of Statistics Act of 1999. So once again, it's not a simple salary survey that's being done online. It is actually the statistical rigor that's behind it and is governed by legislation. Stats SA gives a vast source of household and labour market surveys, and once again gathers a lot of demographic and labour market variables. One of the questions that we have received was what income is stated. The income that is stated is total income. So in the data set, you have individuals that have stated individuals that only earn a basic, and you have individuals that earn basic plus benefits. We then aggregate that data. We cannot, so one of the limitations is that we cannot differentiate between pension fund contributions or medical aid contributions or basic salary. It's typically referred to as total earnings. So in the data set, you get individuals that earn basic income and you get individuals that earn a total package. And for the uses of IOP, that is useful in our opinion, because once again, you're seeing the aggregate of the labour market. You're seeing a more realistic perspective of the labour market. However, once again, you do need to consider each individual in its own socioeconomic context. Okay, all data sets are validated with cross-sectional analysis. So what that means is that different data sets captured by different institutions, there's a cross-validation that occurs between those data sets. So for example, the census data set is cross-validated with the income and expenditure data set. The income and expenditure data set is used for CPI calculations. So once again, there is statistical rigor in the validation and the reliability of the data that's being captured. It is also validated with the post-enumerator survey that is totally independent and run by independent committee. Morag, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Sean. So the detail on the 21st century survey, apologies for my internet problem a few minutes ago, but you'll see here detail on what the survey contains. So the survey's been going for 20 years, and the concept of the survey is that it's a live survey. So we collect updated data as organizations pass increases to their employees. So it's almost like saying it's a photograph. We take a photograph at a point in time, and tomorrow, if there's new data that has shifted because of increases, then the photograph looks different. What is important there is that we don't smooth any data to make it look pretty, to make the photograph look better. The survey is actually an audited survey by an independent auditor, and we've audited it for 10 years in a row now and had 10 clean audits. So the audit process is partly to validate our methodology of calculating the percentiles and the results, but it's also validating that the information we receive as raw data from clients, employers, is exactly what's on the database. So because the survey is live, it means that we can have prevalent jobs on the database. A seemingly silly example is 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was no such job as a barista. Now that job is a full job, and not just in coffee shops, but in hospitality environments, in law firms. So that job now exists on the database because it's prevalent now. So we create jobs as they evolve in the marketplace, with the proviso that there's enough raw data to produce a meaningful result. The data can be cut and diced. So I think what is important, and it's come up through the questions, is that we have to assume all surveys are accurate. It would be crazy for people to be producing inaccurate surveys, but it's about the relevance of the survey. So the being able to dig a little deeper and check which industry am I looking at? Is it the actual role that's relevant, or, as has been referred to earlier, the actual grade or level of the job, the level of work? So that context is important. And what also is important is the detail. So you'll see that we can report on benefits and on actual total guaranteed package, actual cash package. So we can report on any element of pay. And important there, I'm speaking again to some of the questions, is that we collect data from employers. And the two aspects that are important there is that our data collectors make sure that we are then comparing apples with apples. So it's not the person who's validating it can confirm that it's full payroll. It's for every employee in that employer's database. And because of that, the data is actually relevant. So you'll see from this flow diagram that when we collect the data, it is the full payroll. We get all the elements of pay. We spoke earlier in one of the other presentations about the variable pay or the performance-related payments. We separate that out as well because it's not guaranteed year on year, and it's important not to assume that that's a standard amount that a person would be receiving every year. So all the way from the cash portion, each individual benefit, the total guaranteed package or cost to company, and the variable pay, you'd be able to source that line item or the combination. What is important is that we validate the job matches with our clients. So you'll know yourselves that a job title is not meaning the same content across every single employer or even every single employee. So we need to look at job content, and our jobs are matched based on content, not just on title. And we then use that data to calculate the benchmark. So we also present as percentiles. On our website, you can actually look for any 5th percentile. So all the way from the 5th to the 95th. The default is to look at, as Charles described, the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile. And then we update it as clients pass the increases, and that's available via Reward Online, which is the link on the Analytical app, which enables you to access this data. Thank you, Jean.
Okay. So just to ensure that everybody's still understanding, so Analytical provides earnings research based on Stats SA data, and 21st Century provides corporate sector salary data. So many of the questions that we've received was, how do you pick a source of what earnings resources source should you use? And we've come up with this little decision tree, and we'd like industrial psychologists to actually continue to build on something like that. So for instance, I'm going to just start at the top, and this is just for illustrative purposes, and I've said here in the title that the primary consideration should always be your collateral. But if we start at the top, if we have a claimant that is a minor, you typically want a more holistic view of the labor market, because you cannot determine with a high degree of certainty as to what type of occupation this individual will enter into. So in those type of cases, you typically refer to your skill-based scales or your education-based scales, and so forth. I've yet to see any validated information, and maybe my panel can guide me as to how Patterson levels are correlated to education levels, but I'll be guided by my panel on that. The second thing is, does the claimant work in the informal sector? Now, once again, to my knowledge, Stats SA and Analytical are the only providers of informal sector earnings research. We've got data on, for instance, spaza shop owners, street vendors, the entire informal sector, mechanics, plumbers, and so forth. The next question, which is quite important, and here I'm going to ask Morag to chip in as well, is the claimant employed in the formal sector? If the claimant is employed in the formal sector and you want a holistic labor market perspective, then you should use Analytical Stats SA. However, if your claimant is working in a corporate environment, and I'll ask Morag just to explain what corporate refers to here, then you should be guided to use a corporate salary survey. Morag?
Yes, thanks, John. So we're using the word corporate, formal. Probably it would be fair to say that as an organization grows, they are putting in more formal remuneration or reward structures. And that's when they start benchmarking formally and looking at what a comparator market is doing. It doesn't mean that if it's a corporate survey that it's only for huge or even big organizations. A business that needs to start formalizing things could be an organization of 10, 12 employees. So when you access corporate salary data, we call it that, or corporate surveys, formal surveys, you should be able to extract or narrow down your view to a smaller sample if you needed to. So yes, corporate would be covering organizations that are wanting to be more formal, have more equity in their pay practices. It certainly doesn't include the entire South African market as we've acknowledged today. So the complement or complementary offering here is being able to look at informal and formal. Thanks, Sean.
The fourth block that we have there is the claimant working in a structured remuneration environment. So once again, you'd be guided by the employment collateral there. And for instance, a simple example would be that if the claimant's organizational structure does work on Patterson levels and scales, then ideally you should be using corporate salary surveys. The last block that we have there is the claimant employed in the public sector, and I think Charles touched on that. Public sector salary scale should be used, and we have seen in some industrial psychology reports that Patterson scales are used, which is typically not the correct way to go about it. Okay, then we've also had some additional questions on what do we do if the claimant's unemployed at the time of the accident. So you'll need to assess the claimant's career history. Does the claimant have a stable career history in the formal or corporate sector? Then once again, you should be guided to use a corporate salary survey. However, if it's a claimant with limited career history or career history working for companies that do not have formalized policies in place, then you'll need to have a labor market perspective, such as what Analytical provides. And then finally, does the claimant earn on minimum wages? Many claimants that we have dealt with work on minimum wages and sometimes earn overtime. So there you should be guided by your sectoral determinations and not rely on generic scales. So this year we've launched Analytical's app, which provides full access to Stats SA earnings data. We've got a series of tools as well. for you to access. For instance, you will see here the rewards online platform you can access. We've got resources where we share studies from industrial psychologists, government sector salary scales, SAPS salary scales, SANDF salary scales. We've got an inflation calculator for industrial psychologists to use for them to be able to compare apples with apples and not compare a claimant's earnings in 2017 terms to a 2020 salary survey, for instance. We've got unemployment statistics. These statistics are broken down into gender, race, age, and so forth. Then we've got our earnings search function, which is the most important function of our app. There we've got over 410 occupations listed and job families listed. And you can also go very granular into the data. This is an illustration of our occupational search. The user can select in the search category whether they want to search based on occupations. They can type in the type of occupation that they would like to see. They can also toggle between whether they want to see informal sector data or formal sector data. So this, for instance, is an example of a hairdresser in the informal sector. We give you the occupational description. We give you the overall quartiles, the sample sizes. We do earnings by quartile, by province, by age group, and so forth. This you would typically use with claimants that have a set occupational career history. We also have a demographic-based search functionality where you can, this would typically be used for something like minors where you need a more holistic view. The research can be granulated into sector, province, gender, race, education. So for example, you can have a look at what do individuals with an honours degree in the formal sector in the Western Cape earn. And then you can also combine variables or you can remove variables. The Analytical's app, it's based on the amount of users that signs up to register. It is a 12-month running license, and we do include an introductory onboarding session. Now, we have had questions on the ethics and use of data. I'd always recommend calling the data service providers for more clarity before making inferences on the data. So in my mind, the IOP has a limited degree of scope in explaining how the data is collected, what the data is, and so forth. The IOP does, however, need to motivate the applicability of the scales that they're using on a case-by-case basis. I'm going to hand over to Morag again to illustrate the 21st century web-based app.
Okay, you've got 4 minutes left.
Thank you, Sharon.
Perfect, thank you. This will be quick. The reward online, just a few screenshots. You can go to the next one, John, please. Just to give you an idea of how easy the site is to use. You would be selecting a job either through a list of jobs there. You can type the title in, or you can search on a job family function. Please move on, John. And then depending on what you've selected, this is the kind of detail that you'd receive on the website. So you'll see the little drop down arrow next to 10th. That's where you can toggle to the 5th percentile, the 15th, whatever you need. But the default is what you see on the screen now for every element of pay and annualized. Thank you, Jean. So the way the access to the data works is through the Analytical app, where bundles can be purchased from in terms of a quantity of benchmarks. So you can pick how many benchmarks you'd like to buy in a bundle. You receive an onboarding session. The site is very intuitive and easy to use. And you'd then be able to access the report, which you can convert into Excel or PDF, whatever you need, so that you've got the data, including graphical ability. We've got a question around the the relativity to the PE corporate survey. As an example, we get questions around that versus a Deloitte survey or a Hayes survey. I think what's important as a principle is that if you're referencing exactly the same comparator group, then the benchmarks should be exactly the same. So it's about understanding who you are referencing, and that's what's very important in terms of the relevance that we were talking about earlier. The percentiles are statistical, so what's important is that the stats are not translated in different ways by different people. A quartile is calculated the same way by anybody, which means that if the same raw data sits behind it, then the results would reflect the same. But it would be worthwhile for you to know what data you're looking at and what market you're looking at. Thank you, Sean.
Okay, are we at the end? You have a few seconds.
Sean, you can close off.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have addressed most of the questions that we have received from Sharon. These slides will be circulated, and we do give an indication as to where we do answer these relevant questions. Yeah, so I think, Sharon, that's that for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if anybody wants to contact us, our details are on the presentation as well.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that detailed presentation. And yes, the slides will be circulated. So the panel will send me all the updated slides, and then we'll make sure we send it out to everyone. And also, please keep an eye out on the Q&A. So some of your questions are being responded to as we go along, and then some of them will be addressed as part of the live Q&A at the end. Martin, are you ready to kick off? Martin? Okay, my screen is frozen.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, and yes, we can hear you now.
Great, okay, I just need to share my screen.
Great.
There we go.
Awesome. Okay, and you've got your 20 minutes.
Okay, are you picking up the screen there?
Not yet. Did you press the other share screen once you
Yes,
got...
screen. Let me just go back there again.
And the other little block, once you've selected, then you click share screen again, and that should take you to sharing your slides.
Right, share screen. What other little block?
So once you've selected on your PowerPoint, and then there's another block inside that says share screen.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Yes, so you click on that again.
Okay.
Let's see if that works.
Okay, are you picking that up now?
No, not yet. We're only seeing you.
Ah, okay, let me go back to me again.
Yes, let's try again.
Okay. I've got the presentation up there, I've got that. Okay, my presentation's up.
Okay, but there's another button to share screen.
Yeah,
so there are two of them. The second one, okay.
Okay.
So once you click on it and then you share, because we're not getting anything on this side.
Thank you. Okay.
Do you see it?
I've got the share screen button. I'm just clicking on my PowerPoint.
Okay.
How's that?
No, nothing yet. Did you change your slides? Because I can also share on my side.
No, I haven't changed them. So share on your side. It's probably easiest. But the problem I'm having is the minute I go onto the slides, the share screen function is disabled.
Oh, I see. Okay, let me get into your slides.
I've got it on my screen at the moment.
Yeah, it's not. I'm not sure what is happening with that on your side, because once you click, it needs to show. Okay, so let's try this where I share on my side. Okay. All right. Let's just push that up. Okay, you ready to roll?
Ready to roll. Thank you very much. I don't know what happened there. It was working fine previously.
That's fine, not a problem. Okay.
Okay. Good day, everybody. Quite a lot of discussion has taken place, of course, and I'm going to try and avoid repeating what's been said previously, so that it means that I'll adjust and juggle my presentation as we go through. But first, a bit of an introduction. I'm battling to advance the slide here, actually, Sharon.
Okay, so I will have to do it for you.
Looks like we're going to have to do it, yeah.
Yes.
The options. Somebody, I won't fiddle with that. I'll leave it to you. Okay.
Yes.
Let me talk about who we are, first of all. P Corporate Services has been doing remuneration surveys since 1979. So we have an extensive experience in surveys. It's been a very interesting period of time because we've been through very, very many different almost revolutions and evolutions in the nature of earnings within organizations. The surveys we produce cover a national executive survey, a general staff survey. We do a very in-depth survey in the information technology industry, a graded executive planning report, and then surveys of all listed companies' remuneration, and a very wide range of industry sector surveys and regional surveys, and customized client-specific and industry sector-specific surveys. As part of the Willis Towers Watson Group, very new member of the group, we produce the WTW Group produces surveys in over 112 countries around the world. They operate in 140 countries. Very, very detailed, in-depth national surveys within the different geographies concerned, and a great deal of detail on benefits and economic trends and that sort of thing. And that's batched together in a global 50. Talk to you a little bit about the survey process. And again, I'll try and avoid what's been covered in detail previously. Obviously, the first step is to secure participation within the particular survey concerns, what the survey covers. That can range, a survey can range very typically, and I'm taking ballpark figures, between 15 and let's say 900 organizations. A typical global survey, just as a matter of interest, would involve anything between 100 to 200 organizations, quite small by South African standards. But I'm talking about the major survey producers in countries like France, Germany, the Asia Pacific region, even the US. Our national survey sample represents, according to our calculations, give or take 10% of the formal sector workforce, and we do think it has high statistical validity. The scope, obviously, your next step is around what data you collect. Can you go back one quickly, Sharon? Thanks. The scope is around what data you collect, and that defines the input packet, defines how you collect it, and so on. We will collect most of our data online, and I think that's common practice among survey practitioners, typically by payroll download, occasionally by spreadsheets. We do a very detailed data vetting, auditing, and editing process. We work around edit parameter and exception reports. We're quite rigorous about the minimum sample size requirements we require to represent data. Unless you've got a reasonable sample, you do get into confidence level concerns around the validity of what you're reporting, particularly when you start looking at your quartile analysis. And then once that's all put together, we will analyze it and come out with our survey results. That slide there gives you an indication of, and you've seen this previously, so I won't labor it. We will present data in statistical quartiles. The median, the lower and upper quartile figures have already been defined, so I'm not going to waste time on them. We also do a, can you go back one, Sharon? You,
Sorry, I went too fast then.
way too fast, yes. Listen, if you go too fast, I won't finish the comrades. I'll be tired halfway through, you know. we will analyze that into deciles, quartiles, or any cut you like within that. Distributions can very typically be skewed, particularly at executive earning levels, where you'll tend to find a few high values can pull up your average. And it's been mentioned previously, we tend to use as a norm in using ballpark averages. We tend to use the median value as the most representative within a particular category. The 25th and the 75th are used in reference when you do executive benchmarking or general staff benchmarking. Yes, one can create very nice pay distributions, but one needs pay ranges to look at as well. Right, we can go one forward if you wouldn't mind, John. Just a few definitions, and I think it's quite important in looking at these things to get your definitions right. The basic salary is, we define that as the basic cash payment made to an individual at the end of the month. I know we've had questions around, is the basic salary the cash package at certain levels in the organization? Well, we do fairly exhaustive analyses and commentaries on employment conditions, benefits, and that sort of thing. And 85% to 90% of organizations will provide benefits. And I'm taking that definition as organizations within the formal sector. We define the formal sector pretty much as the 70% of organizations that have been referred to by previous presenters. We don't aim to and don't attempt to produce data for the 30-odd% of the formal sector workforce that one would find working, selling the bananas on the side of the road, or just in informal employment of one type or another. 85% of organizations within what we would define as the formal sector, and it's not defined purely by size. It's defined really, we would define it as organizations that have employment policies and would issue an employee with a standard employment contract. 85% to 87% of them as absolute minimum will provide a retirement funding benefit, a medical aid benefit, or something of that nature. There are many other benefits, forms of benefits, but those two are the most common. I sometimes question when people say they've collected data from payslips, whether they've got accurate data, given the fact that many payslips don't necessarily define company contributions, they won't necessarily define incentive pay and so on. But let's go back to making up the package. The second category of items you need to look at as components of what somebody earns would be both your company funded and cash benefits. And I've mentioned some of these, and they obviously are dependent on level in the hierarchy. They can range from housing loans, life insurance, company cars, car allowances, and that sort of thing. And from once you've taken the basic salary plus those benefits into consideration, you will then have what we would define as the guaranteed pay package. That's the fixed remuneration that an employee earns. To that, you've got to add short-term incentive pay, which is quite prevalent in the corporate sector or formal sector, and particularly at the higher levels in organizations. According to our research, something like over 80% of South African organizations offer their employees a form of incentive pay. We would define a short-term incentive as pay you get for hitting or achieving certain key performance areas, key result areas typically within a 12-month period. And then your final pay component, which tends to be a factor at the more senior levels, what we would put within the Patterson D upper bands and the E and the F bands. People at that level in organizations very often they qualify for long-term incentive pay, which would be very typically a share scheme. and we calculate the annualized earnings equivalent of that on an annual basis, which then makes up your total remuneration. We can go one slide forward if we may. I'm going to go through these very quickly. You've seen similar examples. This is a typical example of a page from one of our national surveys, the General Staff Survey. And there you can see we've defined earnings by region. We define them by industry sector. We define them in detailed quartiles. We spell out the various benefits and the value of those benefits, sample sizes. We've got references to the typical job grades using the most commonly applied systems. This is done either in hard copy or online. The vast majority of our participants in South Africa these days, and particularly globally, prefer to work with online surveys, but it is available in hard copy if necessary. Can we go one further forward? Thanks very much. This is a slide from our executive survey. It's also part of the online system we have for surveys at this level as well. It's a typical earnings of a marketing director. And you'll see we have a job description. We have the basic salary, the guaranteed pay, the total employment cost, and that's analyzed by quartiles as well. And we go one more forward. Thanks. I want to make a couple of comments which are just general, talking about the use and application of what's referred to as corporate survey data in our medical and legal reports. A corporate survey, in our view, is the most reliable reference to use as a basis for all commonly found positions within the formal sector workforce. And reputable service providers will provide current market data for these positions as part of their regular salary survey activity, and it's available in the databases and the various surveys, national or industry sector specific as may be required. Market data for specialized positions, very often available in industry sector-based surveys, excuse me, but may also be possible to carry out this by customized research, which of course might be subject to time and cost constraints as well. We analyze our market data by position within the organization. I have a concern around the use of tables which analyze earnings by Patterson grade and by educational level. I can understand the need for these sorts of things in the informal sector analyses that are done, but when it comes to somebody who's in formal sector employment, I think it's very difficult to suggest that if you've got a CA or a marketing degree or an HR degree, that you will be earning a certain amount of money, and that will increase as a function of that particular qualification. So if you get a higher qualification, or even if your job goes to a higher Patterson grade, that can be defined unilaterally. I'll give you an example of that. I, for example, did my first degree in chemical engineering, and I worked for about 5 or 6 years in the chemical industry. I then went into management consulting, and I won't bore you with the rest of my career details. But for the first probably 10 to 15 years of my career, I used to receive a salary survey produced by the University of Cape Town, where I graduated. And it was quite an interesting survey because it was done by the chemical engineering department. I think it was done as a fun thing rather than any serious attempt to predict or monitor pay. But it gave us earnings by years years of service and years after graduation of the engineers. And you will, I've seldom seen a less consistent and less unstructured set of data as was reported into those things. And of course, the problem was that unlike perhaps some lawyers and some doctors who tend to stay a lot truer to their professions than engineers, engineers tend to get out into other areas. And if if you were to look at this survey, which was a function of people who'd graduated in chemical engineering and had worked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 years or whatever, they were doing a wide variety of different things. They were in different positions, in different organizations, at different Patterson grade levels, etc. And to try and find a correlation between the years of service and the years after graduation and things like Patterson levels and further degrees was impossible. We had examples in that survey of people who'd done masters in business, as I did myself, and again, there was no accurate, no reasonable regression between the years of service, the degree qualifications, etc. So
we have 1 minute left, Martin.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me go on to a quick question. A couple of the questions we were asked, and I'm just going to try and address these. I'll deal with two. One was, are the basic salaries, the question reads as follows. Let me do it properly. Are the basic salary figures for employees that only get a basic salary, or does it include people who get a basic salary and benefits? Well, the short answer to that is that the basic salaries are the basic salaries. They would include people, I'm talking just the formal sector as defined. It would include people who are paid only a basic salary, and it would include people who get a basic plus benefits as well. And it would be the basic component of that. But as I've said earlier, 85% of the people get some, in the formal sector, get some form of benefit. It would be most unusual to, relatively unusual to have a package which was a cash only package within that sector. And then finally, just let me take one other question. It was as addressed in an email dated 17th October 2019, the perception of that your salary survey is only applicable to people who work in the corporate sector is false. 27% of the participants in our, this is a response we've made to an email received a few months ago. 27% of the participants in our 2018-19 surveys consist of organizations employing less than 50 people. The question is actually a misquote, because the answer we gave was actually referring to people working in positions in large and medium-sized organizations, not just in the formal sector. But we made the point that the formal sector today is a little different to the formal sector as it was some years ago, in that we have many, many small organizations, and they are formally structured with employment contracts. Let me stop at that point, Sharon. Hope I've covered a few things which weren't totally covered within the prior presentations.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think it's helpful. People have a lot of questions, and some you have addressed. If you check in the Q&A tab, you'll also see more questions that people might have for you there. And I think some of the questions, colleagues, that you're raising around which survey is better comes back to the initial point. What is the purpose? It has to fit the purpose. There's no magic wand to fulfill everything that we need to answer using the available earnings surveys. So thank you, Martin. Averil, are you ready to kick off?
Hope so. I am ready.
Okay.
Right.
Do you want to try share your screen?
Yes. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
And everybody see that?
Yes, we can. Awesome.
Okay. Right. Hello, everybody. I'd just like to thank CEOPSA for affording me the opportunity to present to you today. And just to tell you a little bit about myself briefly. I've got a global reward professional qualification, and I'm also registered as a master remuneration specialist through the South African Reward Association. I started Averil Ryder Global Reward Specialist over 20 years ago, and we have done a lot of salary surveys, but salary surveys that we do regularly are for the non-profit sector. And we have been doing non-profits organization salary surveys for the last 20 years. And we do those surveys every year. We have a general staff non-profit survey, we have a top executive, and we also have a non-executive non-profit fees paid survey. Okay, the purpose of my presentation today is not to allude too much on our surveys, but I just thought that was mentioning, but the importance of what you need to do before you accurately target the correct salary surveys for benchmarking. And I want to start off by talking about the components of a total remuneration strategy. When an organization develops a total remuneration strategy, they need to first of all get their internal equity right. That is ensuring that the people that there's equal pay for equal work internally. Only after they've got that right can they start looking at their external equity, and that is what is the comparator market for the organization and for the roles, and what are those organizations paying. One also needs to look at people equity. Some of the previous speakers spoke about variable pay. I'm not sure whether actuaries need to take that into account or the industrial psychologist, but it's also important to perhaps look at the people equity, and also what is the company's competitive market strategy. I'd like to just unpack those in a little bit more detail. Right, your internal equity, equal pay for equal work within the same organizations. And this involves job descriptions developed in accordance with interviews with current job holders and relevant line management, placing jobs in occupational families, ensuring that job descriptions and occupational families are regularly updated, ensure that job titles are consistent and reflect the nature and level of the positions. You cannot only go by job title. I've seen some crazy job titles, like one of the clients we did work for, they had a job title called Director of First Impressions. And I asked the question, what on earth does this person do? But it was their receptionist. But they valued that job so highly in the organization that it was given a job title of Director of First Impressions. So don't only look at job titles, they can be very, very misleading. I came across another job title recently where the role holder was called a knowledge director, but in actual fact, the person was an operations director. Okay, so then what is very important is the job description needs to be correct. And a good job description will contain the job title, current job evaluation grade, the geographical location of the job, the main purpose of the job, why does the job exist, and the job size parameters. This is very, very important. For example, you might be looking at the remuneration levels for a human resources manager. However, you get various grades and various levels of human resources manager. So you need to look at the size of the organization. How many employees are you looking at? How many geographical locations? Is the organization unionized or not? All that is very important when you're looking at how you're actually going to grade the job and then benchmarking it to the correct salary surveys. Also the reporting structure, who the job reports through to, and what jobs report directly through to the relevant job. What is also very important is the internal-external relationships contacts. In the NPO sector, we get a lot of organizations that are involved with government policy, advocacy, etc. And quite often, the role holders in those jobs, they actually connect and are in meetings quite often with national government, but sometimes not national government, but maybe provincial government, etc. So one needs to always look at the level of the internal and external contacts. It's very important, and it can affect grading. Also working conditions, for example, regular domestic travel required, job holder specifications, and I'll allude to that on the next slide, actual description of key performance areas or tasks, and authorization signatures and dates. As an organization, we've been involved in a lot of job evaluation disputes, and invariably it's not the job grade that's the problem. It goes back to the job description. The job description is old, it hasn't been kept up to date. We've even come across situations where the claimant has never even seen the job description. We had a case a few years ago where the claimant within the organization, an updated job description was submitted, but it never ever went through the correct channels, and therefore the claimant was paid at a lower level because the company in question, their HR department slipped up. So these are all important factors that you need to consider when you're looking at what the market is paying for a particular job. Now, what is also important is job holder specifications, which needs to be on the role profile or the job descriptions. Now, when you're looking at job holders specification, it is what is relevant to the job. Your current job holder could be overqualified or underqualified. And I'm not sure how the actuaries work with something like that. Of course, South Africa, because of our high unemployment level, we often find people with degrees, especially social degrees, in jobs like an executive personal assistant. But you don't actually need a degree to be an executive personal assistant. You need matric level English and computer applications technology. So if you're talking about a certain education level, you need to specify what is required from that matric, or what is required from the degree. You need to be very, very specific for the role. And then relevant previous work experience. As you can see in the example there, 2 years drafting of own correspondence, formatting of documents, taking and drafting of minutes of meetings, and carrying out and drafting reports on desktop research findings. Okay, skills, proficiency in Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook. And before I explain competencies, there's a difference between a skill and a competency. A skill, you can normally upskill somebody in a relatively short space of time, like, for example, learning to drive a car. Once you've learned how to drive a car, that skill becomes automatic. However, a competency or behavior attribute, those are usually developed in childhood and early adulthood. And invariably, you can't send somebody on a workshop to actually learn those competencies. They're normally inbred, like ability to juggle conflicting priorities, assertive, and the ability to emphasize. So those are just some examples. And quite often competencies are very important to a particular role. For example, if the person was an executive, you need a leadership competency. And there should be some demonstration from that going back to childhood and early adulthood. Okay, then your internal equity continued. Once you know that your job description is correct and it's up to date, the job then needs to be graded. In simple words, job evaluation is the rating or ranking of jobs in an organization. It is the comparative process of establishing the value or worth of jobs in a job hierarchy. Remember, your internal equity is internal, okay? And it's very important that you need to get that right. And you always grade the job and not the person. The current job holder could, for example, have had very long service. We come across situations where, for example, you get an accounts clerk. Then we see, oh, but there's also a senior accounts clerk. What is the difference between the two? Oh, the senior has been here for 10 years, but the job is exactly the same. Therefore, the market value of the job would also be exactly the same. Okay, or we also see sometimes with our survey data, because we examine we look at the interquartile data in a sample, and we always investigate anything below or above the interquartile level. And quite often, what happens quite often is somebody is overpaid within a sample. When we investigated, quite often we found that the person was not performing at the higher level and they were put into another job but maintained the same salary. There also seems to be a belief out there that you can't reduce people's salaries. It's not legal, but you can, as long as you do it correctly and on a consultative basis.
You have 4 minutes left, Amro.
Okay, right. I just want to show you some, because I've only got 4 minutes left. Top executive pay. Executives are paid according to the organization size parameters, which is annual turnover or operating budget, annual net profit before tax, market capitalization, value of tangible assets, annual salary and wage bill, total number of employees, as well as you need to look at the company structure. Is it a holding company, a subsidiary, or single unit? Just to give you an idea of how grades differ in the slide you're looking at now, a CO for a single operating unit, and the geographical location is just South Africa, and you're using exactly the same organization size parameters, that CEO would be graded, and that role would be graded in E2, and the grade pay differential would be 75% of the 100%. Then a CEO for a single operation unit, which has operations in several countries within sub-Saharan Africa, those are the countries, that job is graded in E4, and that CEO is paid 100% of the sample. Then a CEO that has several subsidiary companies, however, they are all located in one country, South Africa, that role is graded in F1, and the pay levels would be on average 25% more than the E4. And then CEO for a holding company that has several subsidiary companies located in different geographical countries, that CEO would be graded an F3 and would be paid 50% more than the E4 CEO. So it's important that you get the grade right, but you're not going to get that right unless the job description is correct. Your job description and job evaluation grade of the job informs the benchmarking or internal equity of the job. And the market for any job is where you lose your human capital to or attract your human capital from. And it could differ for different roles in the organization. Okay, I'm not going to go through that. This slide, I just want to show you this slide. This is actually an exercise we did for an organization. It was a non-profit organization, but they also wanted to see what the private sector was paying for the same jobs, as well as what the public or government was paying. So if you have a look at the CEO, the highest payer there is the private sector. The front office administrator, the non-profit sector is the highest payer there in accordance with the median quartile. The human resources officer, the private sector is the higher payer there. The program manager, interestingly enough, the non-profit sector is the higher payer there. And the CEO, the private sector, is the highest payer there. So yes, let's just see. Okay, now I'd just like to end there because it's very important, and just stress that it's hugely important that due diligence is applied. Make sure you get the correct job description or role profile, that it's graded correctly, and that it's also benchmarked to the correct salary survey. Yes, I just want to stress that, because if I think I've got another slide somewhere. No, I've covered that already. The importance of due diligence, and we are very particular, particularly when it comes to job grading, to ensure that we have all the relevant information and that the job is graded correctly. And I'd like to end off there. I don't know if anybody has any questions. There's a lot of other information in our slides, so.
No, thank you very much, Avril. That was very helpful. And colleagues, the slides will be circulated, so you'll have an opportunity to engage with all the information that had been put together. So thank you to our panel. We would now like to open up to the Q&A. Some of the questions were answered, but we still have a couple that need to be answered live. So I'm going to go back to the initial question, and I think Manoko, you said you would respond to this. What are your thoughts about people who are 63, 64, 65 and are putting in a claim? I've recently had a 72-year-old who was in an accident at age 65, and this person was a truck driver. Manoko, over to you.
Thank you very much. Usually when I get cases like this, the deciding factor is that, was this person working and was this person earning an income? And I usually use that as a decide. I mean, you have people that are 60, 75 or so that are still working, that are still earning an income. And as a result of the accident or the incident, they're not able to work anymore. I hope that's sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Charles had also responded in a similar way to say, I think it's fine, especially for self-employed. So if we look at the general trends, people are living longer, they're much healthier, and so they can work for longer. So it brings us back again to the issue of context. Who is the client? What is the context that you're finding them in? What is all the information that is relevant to help you in terms of projecting correctly? Okay, we have other questions. Does 21st century work in the same way as PE? I assume PE corporate. Morag?
I can't comment on exactly how PE corporate works, and it would be appropriate for Martin to also answer, but I think most survey providers, the principle is to collect data, validate it, and report on it. So it should be as simple as that.
Yeah. Okay, Martin, do you have anything else to add on that? Okay, you're muted. Okay, I've unmuted you. Okay, I'm not sure why Martin is muted. Marissa, you're able to unmute him on your side?
Yeah.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Martin, you just need to press your mute button again, please, to unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
How's that? Good. Okay, let me answer. Sorry, I think we were both fiddling with the button at the same time, so we got to we turned 180 degrees instead of 90 degrees. Yeah, I'd support what Morak said. You know, most survey providers, reputable survey providers, of which there are probably half a dozen, maybe a couple less in the country, follow the same general procedure in collecting data. I think the critical thing in a survey is to define what data you're collecting and to make sure you've collected it accurately. And the edit audit function is important. We have people in our organization who worked previously with Deloitte, and they work in much the same way. That was the old FSA survey, for those of you who can remember back that far. And I had experience running the consulting practice for Price Waterhouse for a number of years, and their survey as well, I don't think differs all that much from what's generally available on the market.
Okay, great. Thank you, Martin. I think it also links into the question around, is the data from 21st century, could we expect that the data from 21st century would be similar to that of PE corporate services?
Yeah, Morak made the comment that it should be exactly the same, and it's probably a reasonable comment, Morak. We've done, as I imagine you have as well, we've done on quite a few occasions comparisons of data from different survey providers. One of the things I do quite a bit is board remuneration committee advice at board level, and we're often presented with data from 2 or maybe 3, but mostly a couple of service providers, and we draw comparisons. And my personal experience, whether it be at executive level or general staff level, is the data is usually comparable within 5 to 10%. It obviously depends on the survey sample, the focus. Maybe one survey might have a slightly greater participation from the financial services sector and another one from manufacturing, whatever it is. But our surveys generally tend to have good participation in South Africa by global standards, and you only need probably 150 odd organizations to have a survey which is pretty valid when you look at the confidence levels.
Okay, great, thank you very much. We have another question here. Do you have data for municipalities, earnings providers? Maybe one of you can respond. Do you have data for municipalities?
I can respond on that.
Okay.
Century does have data, and for the state-owned entity environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, as do we. And of course, if you talk about central government, the data is a matter of public record, so that's available.
Okay, so great. Data is readily available. 21st century, WTW also provide that data. Another question here specifically to Analytical. So why did Analytical say that 21st century say their audited salary scales, PE corporate services is also? John, over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to direct that at Morax, and she's at 21st century.
Okay.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Sharon. Yes, as I said, 21st Century's survey, our source data and the methodology is audited independently. I'm not sure how any other surveys are audited and whether they are audited externally. So I'll just comment on 21st Century.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question from Chanel Vanika. I think she was asking about gathering data. I think part of it was answered. I'm trying to find her original question around where we would source data for people who are self-employed or people who are consultants. So someone can respond to that, please. Oh yeah, what is the most accurate source to use for people who are self-employed, such as consultants working in the formal sector? And Rob had responded to say actual performance career history. Does someone else have anything to add on that particular question? So someone who's self-employed?
Well, I guess.
Nobody, sorry, do you want to say something, Avril?
Yes. I think somebody, if you're working as a consultant and you're self-employed, your income is going to be, it's going to be very variable depending on what projects you're working on. So I guess one would have to take an average over a 3-year period. That's my answer. But there are consultants for whom formal survey data is available.
Yes, I could add a bit to that as well, if I may. We actually do a survey of the management consulting profession. We have that as an industry sector survey, and as you say, the data is quite variable. It's also a matter of the nature of the nature of the profession. Obviously, getting up to the more senior levels, if you look at the audit practices, the PwCs, the EYs, the KPMGs, people like that, Deloitte, once you get up to a certain level of responsibility, you become a partner, and your package is very, very different to what you might find in a PTY limited. It's managed differently. It's dependent on obviously overall earnings of the profession and that sort of the firm, sorry, and that sort of thing. But at the more junior consulting levels, yes, you've got reasonable correlation across different organizations. There's some global organizations that pay extremely well, but not outside the boundaries of what you see as a normal salary distribution. The only other thing I'd add is there are a large number of independent consultants, 1 or 2 man bands working as individuals, very often at relatively low fee rates by the larger management consulting practice standards. And many of those people work on an ad hoc basis, and their earnings are defined by what they're able to achieve. So it's a very fragmented industry. One last comment, I don't want to hog the screen and labor it too much, but I remember doing research in the United States about on the management consulting industry. And at that stage, Anderson Consulting, which became Accenture, were the market leaders, and they had an 8% market share. So you can understand it's a pretty fragmented industry.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. Yep.
Just to add to that, when you're dealing with self-employed individuals, as Avril has mentioned, the best case is to look at historic earnings from their business. Often that's where forensic accountants become involved with self-employed individuals. So it's not always, if you're self-employed, that doesn't necessarily always mean that you should receive an earnings progression, because then some individuals reach a capacity limit in the business and don't necessarily always earn more than they've been earning in the established phase in their career.
Great, thanks for bringing that in. And Darlene Turner in the comments also says, you know, look at the actuals, they're always best. So I think that covers that question. There's another question around, we would love to get some clarity on contingencies, if someone could help with that. So the general position with contingencies is that it's not in the domain of industrial psychologists. So you'd find in many reports, industrial psychologists would defer to the legal team to negotiate, because it's not in our capacity to give that guidance. So attorneys would say, what contingency should I put And we often find it difficult to state how much because we don't know. It's not in our area of expertise. I don't know if anyone else on the panel would like to comment on that.
Yes, Sharon, if I may.
Yes.
The one area where the industrial psychologists can help the contingencies is when we get the situation of differential contingencies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you get quite a lot of reports where the industrial psychologist just says same earnings progression as uninjured, but with increased general contingencies. And the degree of disablement affecting the future career path can vary quite widely from 50% is sometimes a differential adopted, but in some cases the disablement is very minor and it's a judgment thing. It's not something you can get out of a statistical journal. It's your feeling as to the degree to which their career is impeded. And you know, a differential of 5% can be too much in some situations. Mm-hmm. So, but whereas some people, the chance they're getting employed is very remote, and it might go as much as 75%. But that is one percentage which an industrial psychologist could be very helpful in providing.
Okay, great. That helps a lot, Rob. Thank you very much. I see we've got 5 minutes left. Manoko, in your opinion, is it appropriate to apply general Patterson figures to claimants that are employed in one of these specific sectors and job roles that have data available by data providers?
Thank you. Yes. I don't quite get the question. If you could repeat it for me again.
And the person is anonymous, so we can't even ask them to comment. So they're saying, in your opinion, is it appropriate to apply general Patterson figures to claimants that are employed in one of these specific sectors and job roles that have data available by data providers? I'm also not clear on what the question is.
Yeah. Especially because they do not list what categories they're referring to. And my standard, is there someone else trying to come in?
Yes, I would be very careful about just doing that, because you need to determine which sector is relevant, which job family is relevant, because those figures would differ depending on the job family, the sector that the person is employed in. Even in the non-profit sector, for example, we have a number of sectors like grant making, healthcare programs, community social services, social housing, legal, etc. And the pay within those sectors vary.
Yeah.
So you can't just apply Patterson grades. You need to perhaps, like we do in our surveys, we develop Patterson pay scales, but based on the individual job families.
Okay, great. Thanks, Avril.
May I add a comment to that? And I don't want to repeat stuff that's already been said. You know, if you look at, for example, a chartered accountant or the financial function in an organization, you look at the human resource function, you look at the IT sector, you can have people employed within those functions or job families, as Avril's referred to, who are graded at a Patterson, let's take a D4 level, for example, who have earnings differentials of up to 15 to 20%, purely by virtue of the labor economics involved, the supply and demand of qualified CAs in South Africa, the supply and the availability of people with those different skill levels.
Okay, thanks, Martin. I want you to answer the career ceiling question. So I'm just jumping around now because we have 2 minutes. So it's asking, do you agree with the commonly applied career ceiling age of 45, which you often find in IOP reports?
Is that addressed to me?
Yes, it is addressed to you directly.
Do I agree? No, I do not agree with it. However, there is career development theory based on that, that individuals plateau at a certain age, but that does not necessarily mean that earnings plateaus at a certain age. Many individuals earn higher post 45 than they do at the age of 45 or before 45. Some would say in many professions that only really kicks in. That's where you really start making a lot of money post the age of 45. So from our research, I cannot totally agree that an earning ceiling is at the age of 45, but a career ceiling could be at the age of 45. It could be earlier. Example would be a plumber. A plumber would stay a plumber as soon as they enter the labor market. So from a career perspective, they've hit their ceiling, but from an earnings perspective, their earnings could increase significantly still as they go older, gain more experience and skill.
Okay, thanks. One more question, and then I'm going to ask the panel if they can answer specific questions via email, and we can share that with everyone. So this question from Tandi, perhaps something we need to consider as IOPs and actuaries. What happens when two IOPs, plaintiff and defense, have used different data sets and the actuarial calculations differ considerably? Which calculations would be relied upon for assisting the courts to settle the matter? Who would like to take that one?
My answer to that is go back to the basics. Where does the data come from? What was used to grade the job? What survey was used? Was it relevant to the job and to the sector, etc.? So one would have to go back to the basics.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I see there are more questions that are trickling in. There was a question for you, Averil, around comparing, I think it was the task. I can't find the question. Okay, can Averil show how the task grading system used by government compares to the Patterson grade? And Tandi's hand is up, Marissa. And we have a few raised hands. Can we do an extra 5 minutes? I see lots of hands and questions keep popping in.
Sharon, we can maybe perhaps make a general comment on COVID-19 as well, since it's very topical.
Yes, very good idea.
So maybe I think, because I've seen some questions, because Robert mentioned that his office is not projecting an impact at the moment. I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, that would be from an actuarial perspective. So life expectancy and discounting type assumptions, we agree as actuaries, that's probably not affected at the moment. But from a career perspective, from the industrial psychologist, I would say very much it is an impact. And also, it's not a source of loss. We've even seen reports recently where, because of COVID-19, someone's lost their job. And now, they're saying that's the injured state, but clearly that would have happened uninjured as well. So I think that's just a concept to bear in mind, that something like this would have happened regardless of the accident. And likewise in a loss of support claim, if the spouse, was planning to work regardless of the accident, or if she worked because of the accident, that will determine, whether you take it into account or not. So it's basically, thinking of the what would have happened, but for the accident situation fully throughout all the postulations.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Charles. Tandi's hand was up. Marissa, do you want to unmute her?
Yes, at this stage, Shashini's hand was up. So Shashini, you're welcome to just unmute yourself and then you can state your question. If there's anybody else that would like to ask something, you can just use the raise your hand function. Shashini, you're welcome to speak.
Thank you, colleagues, for this informative and professional information sharing session. I just want to make a comment with regard to COVID. I think I agree with Dr. Koch and with Charles. However, I think in terms of progression and the impact of COVID must be taken consideration of, because in fact, with the decreased employment and reduced employment opportunities, it would actually have a direct implication in terms of individuals' securing opportunities for progression, and how it would impact corporates in affording such progression. So those are some of the things I've considered in my reports for reflection on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sashini. Anyone else who would like to ask a question or comment before we close the session?
Yes, just one comment on this COVID thing. We
Mm-hmm.
can't forget that there are thousands of reports out there which were drawn up before COVID arrived. It is the common thing for reports to be updated when the opportunity arises, and certainly when that happens, then one has to have regard to what one thinks is going to happen after COVID, which I don't think any of us can reasonably guess, except that there will be some approach to normality, but not entirely.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Robert. Morag has a comment. Morag?
Thanks, Sharon. Just to note that I think the impact of COVID will be seen in the future. What we're seeing in the market is that organizations are making crisis decisions like holding a portion of payback, not paying 25%, some even not paying 80%, but it's transitional for survival reasons. And it doesn't mean that that is the pay of the person, it's a crisis pay. And we'll see, I even want to say next year, if you are referencing live surveys, then you'll see the impact, A, in terms of the employee count going down as businesses retrench, but then you'll see what the earnings are for those people that still have jobs, because it'll not be a transitional arrangement, it'll be the permanent arrangement as opposed to a crisis decision.
Okay, great. Thank you, Morag. Martin, did you have a comment?
Similar to what Morag said, I'll just add without repeating. We've done a couple of global and national surveys on the impact of COVID-19, and the results have shown that the results we've got have shown that something like 50% of companies have cut pay. Varies by the amount of the pay cut, varies by level. It goes up to something like 20-25% at the more senior levels, down at about 10% at the slightly lower levels. And the consensus, if there is a reasonable consensus, is that companies are expecting something like a 2-year impact of COVID. But of course, that's speculation. You know, none of us really knows how long it's going to go on for, and what the recovery rate is going to be. It does illustrate the importance of using current pay data when you look at things like claims or anything else for that matter. And it does also emphasize the point that the rate at which companies are able to restore existing pay levels depends on their affordability. You know, it might be just impractical for them to restore pay to normal levels within a relatively short period of time, and then it becomes a debate around: is it better to employ people or at a reasonable, you know, at a lower level? I personally believe that the gap between executive pay and general staff pay is going to narrow in any event in South Africa, irrespective of COVID, due to a variety of social and socio-economic pressures. I mean,
no, absolutely. And that's where we need to expand our thinking as IOPs and not just take one approach, but really apply our minds. Jean, you had a comment you wanted to add?
Yes, research done by the International Labour Organization has shown that COVID is going to have a significant impact on youth unemployment. So so there'll be a delay of entry into careers. There'll be a delay of entry into educational institutions. This will create a demand and supply shortage of skilled or educated individuals in the labor market as well. You'll also find parents not being able to to send their kids to university or higher institutions now due to salary cuts and so forth. So these are, I think this is important for IOPs, because IOPs do not only need to understand remuneration data or remuneration service providers. That's just the cherry on the top with regards to the earnings benchmarks. But it's understanding all of this labor market circumstances and dynamics at play with each claimant. So beyond the salary survey.
Great, thank you. One last question, and then we have to close. We're 10 minutes beyond what we had agreed on. Thandi, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes. Just firstly, I would like to thank the panel, everybody that shared this valuable information. We learned a lot. Yes, unfortunately, there are some questions that still remain, but hopefully as we engage, we will ask the questions and maybe the panelists and the experts will answer us on these questions. Going back, I'm sorry to have to belabor the point, but I think when I asked the question, realizing the practicality of we are back at work, tomorrow we'll be submitting reports, next week we'll be submitting reports. We still have scenarios of plaintiff and defendants. Yet, yes, I know we're talking about mediation, but it's still not yet fully kicked in. The reality of the matter is, with what we've learned today and going forward, we find a scenario next week where a plaintiff and between a plaintiff and a defendant IOP, there's two reports having relied on two separate datas. The calculations, actuarial calculations differ considerably. The court has to make a decision. Yes, I appreciate the answer from Avril to say we'll have to go back to their job and analytically look at the job, the grading thereof and whatsoever. But the court needs to make a decision. Now, whose report does the court rely on between the two IOPs? I think this is where my question is, and I'm probably looking at it too much on the practical sense of saying, beyond this, yes, we have all of these data sets, all of them very credible, all of them very useful. But the reality is, if two IOPs land up with two reports for the courts to make a decision, having relied on two different sets, what does the court do? Especially bearing in mind that the reality of today is that with litigation, we still have between plaintiff and defendant lawyers a tug of war. I think this is where I'm looking at it to say, what is the practical sense? Where do we go from here, guys?
Okay, thank you, Thandi. So I'm looking at the panel and seeing who's got the biggest smile and ready to respond.
I mean, I can, because I've been to court quite a few times, and I've obviously seen this happen quite a few times in court. So it really depends on the judge and on the legal teams, and so it's impossible to answer. And I think that's one of the things, as I mentioned, that really needs to be ironed out beforehand. So either settlement or mediation, or in a joint minute phase, some form of agreement needs to happen before it reaches the court, ideally, because realistically speaking, the judges and the advocates typically do not have enough understanding. And, it very much depends on the quality of both sides, advocates, and the questioning. If it comes to cross-examination of two IPs with widely different inputs, it will come down very much to luck of the draw, in my opinion.
Can I add to that as well? Charles, I agree with you from personal experience. I've done many loss of earnings court appearances and many pay arbitration appearances, and had instances for example, in CCMA hearings where the CCMA have turned around and said, look, you two, there've been two pay reports, maybe one for the union, one for the company, whatever it might be. And I've had occasions where they've said, you two guys go and sit down and try and thrash out what's fair. And, by and large, you're dealing with reputable people from reputable organizations. And it's quite reasonable to expect the people who are given the expert opinions to sit down and try and gain some kind of consensus. I accept the point that the lawyers handling the case don't have depth knowledge on how you put together a loss of earnings report. That's why you've got an expert there. Yeah. But it does boil down to very, very clear and concise questioning by the I go into those sessions sometimes expecting to be grilled, and sometimes I am, but 80% of the time the questions are very soft, in my opinion.
Yeah, not an easy answer, John.
So Sharon, I think it starts with internal professional development in the industry. Trying to figure out what salary surveys to apply to what type of claimant. If you've got that kind of decision tree or approach that is standardized across the industry, not saying that all reports should look the same, but the critical thinking that goes into a report should be similar across experts. So that there's no confusion having two similar scales, but from two different resource providers, and this major disparity. So I think it's going to start changing now, and I do hope that the profession applies their mind into how to make those different decisions.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately, we have to close this very interesting conversation. A very big thank you to our panel. I really appreciate the time and the effort that all of you put into this. And also a big thank you for sponsoring us to help us with our administrative costs. We are a non-profit organization, so every little bit that we can get from organization helps us to continue to host. And also in light of COVID-19, we offered this webinar for free because we are mindful of what is going on for different professionals who would like to access this information. And in the bigger scheme of things, we want the conversation to continue. Just reading the comments from people, they're saying this is fantastic. We need to have more diverse panels where we have all these different players sitting at the table. I think that is the magic in all of this. We need to see one another. We need to hear one another from the different places. And I'm so thankful for the collaboration and the generosity. And I hope for many more conversations. To the SIOPSA technical team behind the scenes, thank you, Louise. Thank you, Marissa. Really appreciate all the support. And yeah, to all our attendees, thank you so much. We will circulate the slides and the recording. Have a beautiful afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Sharon, I just want to say also thank you from my side as the president of SIOPSA to our psycholegal chair, Sharon, currently, that arranged the session, and to all panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and knowledge. And I believe that the attendees definitely got a lot of knowledge and some insight into some of these matters. So from my side, thank you so much, and have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Marissa, shall we stay on for a little bit just to close up? And we can let everyone else get all.
Thank you, everybody. Very much.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. And please remember to send me your updated slides so we can circulate.
Sinking low, scatterlings and fugitives, hooded eyes and weary brows, seek refuge in the night. They are the scatterlings of Africa, each uprooted one, on the road to Bellamanga, where the world began. Of Africa, each and every one, in their hearts a burning hunger, beneath the copper sun. may be here and wide, beneath the copper sun. African idea, African idea, make the future clear, make the future clear. And we are scatterings South Africa, both you and I. We run the road to Belamanga, beneath the copper sky. And we are scatterings South Africa, on journey to the sky. Far below we live forever, dreams of what we were. Through all the days